Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval world that smells like damp wool, smoky candles, and freshly brewed ale. Picture this, a frost-covered convent nestled on a hill in 13th century Germany. The bells have yet to chime for morning prayers, but already there's movement in the lower cloisters. Not from the chapel, no, not yet, but from the brewery. A room filled with the scent of warm mash and the low hiss of boiling liquid. It's not the monks stirring. It's the nuns. And they are getting ready to brew. You're groggy as you shuffle down the stone corridor. The air is cold, the floor's colder. You pass sisters in heavy habits, moving in quiet procession toward the brewing chamber. One of them, tall, strong-looking, with sleeves rolled to the elbow, nods at you. That's Sister Bertha. She'll be in charge of today's batch. Her hands are already stained from barley and yeast. You wonder if she ever actually prays, or if she's always elbows deep in fermentation. Oh, and a quick reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this. Between the early wake-up calls, the vow of silence, and the daily menu of turnips, pottage, and low-alcohol beer, your modern sensibilities would tap out before Compline. Still sound relaxing? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where in the world you're all tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow Sister Bertha into the brewing chamber. It's warm here, a kind of sleepy warmth, where barley steams in a massive copper kettle and sunlight cuts through stained glass, striping the air with color. The brewing starts before the first prayers, and there's a reason for that. Brewing takes time, not just hours but days. It also takes silence, patience, and the kind of organization that convent life absolutely excels at. The sisters don't brew just for fun, of course. This is daily nourishment. Back then, water wasn't exactly crystal clear. It came from wells, ditches, and public fountains often shared with livestock. Germ theory wouldn't be a twinkle in anyone's eye for another 500 years. So instead of drinking straight water, people, especially those in religious orders, relied on beer, or more precisely, small ale, a very low alcohol, lightly fermented drink brewed fresh each week. It was clean, filling, and had just enough alcohol to kill off waterborne pathogens, but not so much that it made morning mass a dangerous sport. You ladle a sip from a wooden cup. It's warm, not cold and fizzy like a modern pint. Earthy, slightly sour, with a hint of whatever herbs the sisters had on hand. No hops yet, not in most places. That comes later. This is simpler stuff. Think liquid bread with a sprinkle of mint. Historians still argue whether nuns brewed exclusively for their own community or whether they routinely traded with locals under the radar. Some believe certain convents became low-key community beer hubs, offering clean drink to villagers in exchange for labor or supplies. Others claim the brewing was internal, devotional, and tightly regulated. The truth? Like most medieval things, it probably depended on the century, the country, and the abbot's mood. But here, in your sleepy little cloister, the rhythm is clear. Brew in the early hours. Let it ferment quietly as prayers are whispered. Bottle it before vespers. Drink sparingly. Share freely. The equipment's nothing fancy. A mash tun, a copper boiling kettle, buckets, strainers made from horsehair or cloth, and giant wooden paddles for stirring. The sisters lift these with ease. Forget the image of the frail nun bent in prayer. Some of these women are tank-armed and calloused, just as likely to lift a sack of barley as a book of hours. Sister Agnes, the oldest among them, walks with a slow limp, but you swear she can still outbrew anyone else. Her secret? Stir clockwise in silence, counterclockwise in song. No one's sure why, but it seems to work. And yes, the nuns prayed over the brew, but not in the mystical way you might think. Prayers were part of everything. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening, tending the sick, and yes, brewing. They weren't asking the ale to become holy wine. They were asking it not to spoil, explode, or make everyone violently ill. Reasonable goals. One sister scribbles in a little book, noting the boil time and temperature, as best as medieval tools allow. These records matter. Brewing, for nuns, was also about discipline and reproducibility, long before anyone knew the word science. As the light outside rises and the steam thickens, your eyes get heavy. The pace here is slow, repetitive, comforting. One sister kneads a sack of malted barley like bread dough. Another gently checks the fermenting cask, listening for bubbles like it's a baby breathing in sleep. A cat walks across the rafters. Nobody minds. Convents always had cats. They kept the grain stores mouse-free and occasionally got tipsy lapping up spilled ale. And yes, if you're wondering, sometimes they accidentally brewed it too strong. A triple ale might sneak in if the barley ratio was high and fermentation time long. Did that stop the sisters from drinking it? Sometimes. Other times, let's just say Vespers got a little more enthusiastic. Even now, Sister Bertha wipes foam from the rim of a barrel, gives you a wink, and mutters, "This one's got spirit." You're pretty sure she means it literally. Before the next bell tolls for morning prayers, the fire is banked low, and the steam has faded. You feel it, the strange calm that comes from repetitive labor, warm air, and barley-scented robes. A nun hums faintly, not a hymn, a brewing song passed down from sister to sister. And you're just along for the ride. You step out of the brewing chamber and into the cool stone corridor again, trailing steam and barley scent like a cloak. The nuns have gone quiet, drifting back toward their other duties. But you linger, because you're not done with this mystery yet. How did nuns, of all people, get so good at brewing? To understand that, you've got to go back, way back, to when the earliest monasteries were still sketchy little clusters of wooden huts. You're walking now through a centuries-old memory, past hand-dug wells and small wooden altars. Monks and nuns alike are living rough, scraping together enough food and drink to survive, often isolated from towns, often completely self-sufficient. They grow their food, they raise chickens, and crucially, they ferment. Fermentation is one of those ancient, slightly magical processes that medieval people didn't totally understand, but absolutely relied on. Leave grain soaking long enough, add the right herbs, warm it over fire, and if the gods are kind or the saints are listening, you get beer. It's not fancy, it's not filtered, but it's safe to drink. And in the Dark Ages, that was nothing short of miraculous. You pass a dusty alcove where a nun is mashing up stale bread to reuse for brewing. Waste not. That's rule number 1 here. Every scrap of barley, every crust of bread, even wild hops, if they've got them, gets put to use. It's not about profit. It's about not dying of dysentery. Cozy. Historians still argue whether early brewing was more experimental or rote. Some think the religious orders had notebooks full of detailed measurements and procedures, handed down like family recipes. Others think it was more vibes-based. Stir until it smells right. Boil until the cat leaves the room. Honestly, both sound plausible. As you move down the hall, you stop by the convent's small herbarium. Rows of dried herbs hang from the rafters: yarrow, rosemary, mugwort, maybe even a sprig of wormwood if Sister Helga was feeling bold. Remember, hops weren't yet the standard. They were still a strange novelty in many places, especially for nuns brewing in Northern Europe. Instead, grut, the ancient herbal blend used to flavor and preserve ale, was the norm. You sniff a bundle of dried herbs and get a hit of lavender and bitter wild thyme. It smells like sleepy afternoons and ancient medicine. That's because it was medicine. Brewing wasn't just about hydration. It was about healing. Nuns brewed stronger alesh for pilgrims, for the sick, for other nuns recovering from fevers. Some even doubled as apothecaries, balancing prayer with a solid understanding of which herb soothed which pain. Sister Hildegard of Bingen comes to mind. She's basically the Beyoncé of medieval nuns. Abbess, mystic, composer, and yes, brewer. She was one of the earliest figures to write about hops and their preservative properties. Did she drink? Debatable. Did she brew? Absolutely. And she wasn't the only one. There's a quiet pride in the way the nuns handle the brewing process. Not flashy, not boastful, just efficient. Just good. Some convents produced beer that rivaled anything the local monks could make. But because the church didn't like the idea of women running economic ventures, much of their brewing stayed under the radar. Historians still argue whether this was an act of quiet defiance or simply practicality. Either way, the sisters kept brewing. You step back into the brew chamber, and there's Sister Bertha again, sleeves rolled up, face flushed. She's adjusting the fire under the copper kettle, using a long iron poker like it's a sacred tool. Around her, the mash bubbles softly, thick, golden, nearly alive. She gestures to a small painted panel nailed above the door. It's Saint Bridget of Kildare, the unofficial patroness of nuns and, get this, of brewers. According to legend, she once turned her bathwater into beer for visiting bishops. That's multitasking, and yes, you smile. Because of course a woman who led a monastery and made her own ale would end up as the patron saint of fermentation. Makes sense, doesn't it? The day grows long outside. A bell tolls in the distance, and somewhere someone is chanting a psalm. But here in the brewery, time feels suspended. The mash settles, the fire hisses low, and a cat is curled on a sack of barley like it owns the place. Probably does. You run your hand along the wooden barrel. It's warm, alive. You can feel the faint hum of fermentation beneath your fingertips. It's easy to forget this isn't just food. It's chemistry. Wild yeasts from the air, sugars from the grain, herbs to flavor, heat to coax it all together. A delicate dance, and the nuns are master choreographers, and they don't waste a drop. The thicker sludge from the bottom of the barrel gets used in bread or fed to animals. The leftover mash becomes gruel. Even the foam, called barm, is sometimes skimmed off and used as leavening in baking. Nothing is discarded. Everything is repurposed. Your favorite 21st century sustainability blog has nothing on 12th century nuns. By now, your eyelids are heavy. The warm air, the slow fire, the rhythmic sounds. It's hypnotic. Sister Agnes hums again, this time a lullaby. You recognize it from the morning, though it's slower now, almost drowsy. She stirs the ale like she's tucking it in for the night. And you're not far behind. You wake, barely, to the sound of gentle footsteps and the clink of a ladle against metal. The brewery is cooler now, the fire banked down to a soft glow. You're still in the convent, still wrapped in the cozy barley-sweet warmth of the brew chamber. You stretch, blink slowly, and realize Sister Bertha has moved on to the next step in her methodical, sacred routine. You're here just in time for the transfer. The mash, that thick porridge of warm grain and water, is ready to be strained. There's no industrial strainer, no chrome equipment, just wooden buckets, linen cloth, and patience. You watch as the warm liquid, now called wort, gets poured slowly through a sackcloth filter into a waiting vat. It's a glowy amber color, like honey caught in candlelight. It smells faintly of biscuits, damp earth, and chamomile. The sisters are quiet now, focused. It's meditative, really like prayer with ladles. It might surprise you that all of this brewing knowledge was passed down not through manuals, but through memory. The brewing nun was often a senior sister, one who'd learned from the one before her. Historians still argue whether some convents had full instruction books or if they depended solely on oral tradition. Likely it was both, a mixture like their ale. You sidle closer to the barrels and spot a carved rune on one of the wooden staves. It's not Latin. It's not even fully decipherable. Some say these marks were signatures, brewing codes to identify the sister or batch. Others argue they were protective charms. Brewing was tricky business, and when a barrel went bad, you didn't always blame the yeast, you blamed the spirits. And while we're on the subject of spirits, not the kind that get you tipsy, you should know that brewing wasn't always seen as pure work. It had an aura of the mystical. After all, you're creating something that bubbles, expands, hisses, and smells alive. It's a little unnerving, like something might wake up in the vat and say hello. So, some convents sang psalms over their beer, not just to pass the time, but to bless it, to keep whatever mischief might be lurking at bay. One particularly fun tidbit you'll love? In some regions, it was customary to name the brewery's largest fermenting vessel. That's right. These were big, wooden tubs, practically hot tubs, and each one had a name like Agatha or the Good Lady. You glance at a chalk scribble on the side of one enormous barrel here. It reads, charmingly, Saint Froth. It might be a joke or maybe not. Either way, it makes you smile. You walk a slow loop around the fermenting barrels. It's cool down here, stone walls sweating with condensation. You hear the occasional plop of foam, the soft creak of wood expanding in the moist air. It's almost like the beer is breathing. And here's where things get delicate. Fermentation is a waiting game. The yeast, which lives invisibly in the air and on the grain, gets to work now. It eats the sugar in the wort and produces alcohol and bubbles. But the sisters can't see this. They just know it works. Or it should. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers understood yeast at all. Some think they thought it was divine intervention. Others believe they recognized yeast behavior without fully understanding the microbiology. Either way, it worked. Sister Bertha doesn't need a microscope. She just knows the temperature, the smell, the color. She's seen this happen hundreds of times. And she trusts it. You hear a soft chuckle from one of the older sisters. She's telling the story, half-whispered, of the batch that exploded. Yes, really. A particularly lively fermentation once caused a barrel lid to blow clean across the cellar. They say it hit the far wall so hard it left a dent. The novices still point it out like a badge of honor. Brewing isn't for the faint of heart. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because unlike monks, who often sold their beer to fund massive abbeys and monasteries, many nuns brewed just for the community. Their ale didn't hit the local taverns. It nourished the sick, warmed the cold, fed the guests, and helped the sisters sleep. Ale was also part of daily rations. Yes, that means you, as a visiting guest, would receive bread, cheese, and beer. Breakfast of champions. And not a weak brew either. Some nunneries were known for surprisingly potent batches. Not that anyone admitted it. But a few cheeky parish records hint at visiting bishops leaving in good cheer, which is medieval code for slightly wobbly. You reach a small wooden desk tucked into the corner. On it, a parchment ledger listing barrels by date and name. Trinity Batch, Feast Brew, Healing Ale. One line catches your eye. Ladies Smile, for the winter fevers. The sisters weren't just making beer, they were customizing it. Adding extra ginger, maybe some honey or elderflower depending on who needed what. And you wonder, how did they learn this? Who taught them which herb soothed a cough, which grain produced more foam, which barrel needed to be turned every third day? The answer, you suspect, is the same as always: the sisterhood. Quiet experimentation, gentle records, long observation, the kind of knowledge you can't buy, only live through. You lean against a cool wall now, eyes fluttering, head filling with the gentle, bubbling rhythm of the fermentation cellar. The convent is hushed again. No one hurries. Nothing clangs. Even the mice seem sleepy. And you, wrapped in this slow ritual of barley and thyme, realize something. Brewing isn't just what these nuns do. It's who they are. It's woven into the rhythm of their prayers, the scent of their robes, the warmth of their halls. A daily miracle lovingly repeated. You wake again, if you ever truly slept, and realize the scent in the air has shifted. Gone is the yeasty sweetness of mash and early fermentation. In its place is something tangier, sharper, but still oddly comforting. The brewing chamber is dim, lit by just a few flickering tapers set in wrought iron sconces. Sister Bertha is nowhere in sight. Instead, you find yourself drawn toward a smaller adjoining room, a kind of cozy apothecary meets madhouse hybrid. Wooden shelves grown under jars of herbs, bundles of dried flowers, and strange little sacks labeled in looping Latin script. One reads Calamus, another Sambucus. You brush a finger across a dusty jar. Dried orange peel, crisp and curling like forgotten parchment. This is the convent's herb room. And this is where the real alchemy happens. Before hops became the go-to beer stabilizer across Europe, brewers relied on a far more unpredictable and often fiercely guarded set of ingredients known as grut. You mouth the word slowly. Grut isn't one plant, but a wild medley of bittering herbs. Bog myrtle, yarrow, mugwort, wild rosemary, and sometimes, well, no one really agrees. Historians still argue whether the recipes changed seasonally or remained stable over generations. But what's clear is this: medieval nuns were masters of it. Sister Marilda, the convent's unofficial herb witch, and that's your term, not hers, glides silently past you. A copper scoop in one hand, dried herbs in the other. She doesn't speak, but hums under her breath, some half-remembered chant you can't place. As she sprinkles the herbs into a small cloth pouch, you realize this part of the process is practically magical. Not for show, not for theatrics, but because no two brews taste the same, and Marilda makes sure of it. She tucks the gruit into the cooling wort with a reverence normally reserved for holy relics. You watch as the blend swirls gently, transforming the amber liquid into something deeper, more mysterious. The scent sharpens, almost lemony, but then floral, and finally, a faint medicinal tang that reminds you of cold winter nights and grandmother remedies. Interestingly, the nuns didn't just flavor their beer this way for fun. Some of these herbs had serious effects. Mugwort, for example, could induce vivid dreams, or at least that's what the records suggest. Wild rosemary, possibly toxic in high doses. Yarrow, a known wound stopper and fever fighter. Whether the nuns fully understood the biochemical interactions, or just observed results over time, is unclear. But they treated the brewhouse like a pharmacy. And you're standing in the center of it all, like a very sleepy lab assistant with zero credentials. What's more, gruit wasn't just a recipe, it was a source of tension. Secular authorities, bishops, even kings occasionally tried to tax or control the right to make it. In some regions, a gruit right gave specific religious institutions monopoly access to the needed herbs, turning the beer trade into political theater. There are whispered stories, tucked into the footnotes of dusty church records, of nuns accidentally cultivating outlawed herbs or misplacing permits. Let's just say Sister Marilda knows where the bodies aren't buried. You wander toward a wooden bench, trailing your fingers across bundles of herbs suspended from the beams. There's lavender for calming the nerves, sage for purification, a little mint for clarity. Brewing, you realize, wasn't just nourishment, it was a kind of herbal therapy doled out in mugs. And just when you think this herbal dreamscape couldn't get more enchanting, Sister Marilda turns to a second pot, this one much smaller. She ladles out a bit of the gruit-infused wort and pours it into a stoneware cup. No ceremony, no bells, just a knowing look. You lift it to your lips. Tastes confusing. There's the sweetness of malt, yes, but it's layered under something wild and sharp. Bitter, but not unpleasant. The aftertaste lingers like clover and cracked pepper. You're not sure whether you're drinking medicine, beer, or tea. Marilda watches with an amused eyebrow. You nod slowly, dazedly. She chuckles softly and turns back to her jars. There's a debate among scholars, of course there is, about how much autonomy brewing nuns had. Some suggest they had to defer to male clergy for recipe approval. Others argue, with convincing evidence, that once the beer was brewing, the convent was in full command. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between, flavored by geography, politics, and the sheer stubbornness of the sisters. What's undeniable, however, is that nuns carved out their own space within the church's rigid hierarchy. Through their brews, they funded hospitals, fed the poor, and maybe, just maybe, swayed a bishop or two with a particularly well-aged cask. Outside, night presses more firmly against the convent walls. Rain begins to patter on the slate roof, soft and rhythmic. You're still sitting beside the herb bench, legs warm, head full of brew-scented fog. In the corner, a novice is carefully copying a recipe onto parchment. She frowns, pauses, then dips her quill again. You notice she's writing from memory, not reference. The brewing knowledge is being passed on line by fragrant line. Before you drift off again, you make out a final shelf, tucked behind the others. On it, a few small stone bottles sealed with wax. Tinctures, perhaps, or maybe something stronger. The nuns keep their secrets well. And you? You breathe deep, the scent of mugwort and roasted grain threading through your dreams, and let yourself sink once more into the slow, amber tide of monastic brewing. You wake to the sound of soft, rhythmic clinking, wooden paddles knocking gently against copper vats. The brewing room is humming again, though now the nuns have taken on a quieter energy. The sun has begun its lazy climb over the cloister walls, spilling drowsy light through the arched windows, catching on the steam curling up from a freshly scrubbed floor. Someone is humming a hymn in Latin, or possibly just improvising the melody, hard to tell. You stretch your legs, brushing malt dust from your tunic, or wait, Were you wearing a tunic? No matter. The important thing is that today is bottling day. Or rather, barreling day. You shuffle behind Sister Genevieve, who smells faintly of sandalwood and has the hunched posture of someone who's been carrying casks longer than you've been alive. She's leading you to the coldest part of the cellar. Now, it's easy to assume that in the Middle Ages, storing beer was some rudimentary affair. Big barrels, dark corners, hope for the best. But in reality, these nuns had surprisingly advanced methods for preserving their brews. In this particular convent, nestled in the foothills of what we now call the Rhineland, they've developed their own system of clay-lined fermentation vessels, cool air vents carved into stone, and a rotation schedule so finely tuned it rivals modern breweries. You trail your fingers along the rim of one open cask. Inside, the beer is gently bubbling, fermentation still at work. The scent here is sharper, yeastier, and tinged with that earthy tang you now associate with Sister Marilda's herb blend. You notice the lids stacked nearby, each carved with a small sigil, not just to label, but to protect. Beer, after all, is a living thing and in some convents a sacred one, which leads you to an unexpected discovery. Tucked into a worn corner of the cellar, there's a small alcove, almost like a shrine. Candles, some melted flat with age, surround a carved wooden statue of Saint Bridget. She's holding, is that a mug? Yes, a wooden cup raised in blessing. Turns out, Saint Bridget of Kildare, beloved by many nuns, was also the unofficial patron of brewing. According to one cheerful legend, she once turned her bathwater into beer for thirsty lepers. Historians still argue whether such stories were symbolic, exaggerated, or the result of translation errors. But the affection for her in brewing convents was very real. Her feast day was often celebrated with special casks, often with a slightly sweeter brew than usual, a kind of ecclesiastical happy hour. And this little alcove is not just for decoration. Sister Genevieve crosses herself before placing the sealed barrel beneath Bridget's watchful gaze. You do the same, mostly out of peer pressure. Now here's a curious tidbit. While monks are famously associated with brewing, many early beer innovations actually came from nuns. There's scattered evidence, letters, ledger notes, even graffiti in abbey margins that suggests women religious were experimenting with batch sizes, ingredients, and preservation methods well ahead of their monkly counterparts. In fact, some of the earliest recorded instances of boiling beer to stabilize it come from convent records, not monasteries. You glance toward a tiny window cut into the stone. Cool air seeps through, hitting your cheeks. This passive cooling system is just one of the clever tricks these women used. Without modern refrigeration, controlling fermentation temperature was essential, and they did it with underground chambers, shaded courtyards, and schedule rotations timed to the seasons. Frankly, if they'd been given more funding and fewer ecclesiastical rules, they might have invented lagers centuries earlier. Another monk-friendly myth shattered. You watch as the nuns begin labeling the barrels. Not with modern branding, of course, no cheeky logos or mascots, but rather with symbols. A star for holy days, a fish for Lenten brew, a tiny snail for slow-aged, which is either a reference to the maturation process or to Sister Genevieve's legendary pace. No one is quite sure. And then there's the X mark. That one catches your eye. You point to it and one of the younger sisters, Sister Imelda, maybe 16, cheeks still round and voice like a whisper, giggles softly. That one, she explains, is the watch yourself batch. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's strong enough to make even the abbot blush. She says this with the straightest face imaginable. You make a mental note to find that barrel later. There's also a debate, Imelda tells you, over how much beer the nuns actually drank themselves. Some sources claim they were allowed just a cup or two per day, strictly rationed, of course. Others suggest that during fasting seasons, when solid food was prohibited, beer was essentially a meal replacement. And if your meal was particularly well brewed, well, you might go back for seconds. Or thirds. Imelda shrugs, eyes twinkling. God understands, she whispers, and skips off down the corridor. It's easy to forget that these nuns weren't just beer makers. They were chemists, managers, laborers, and occasionally quiet rebels. The brewing operation wasn't a side hustle. It was essential. It funded their orphanages, supplied their hospitals, and cemented their place in a society that often saw women, even holy women, as background characters. You lean back against a barrel marked with the fish symbol. The air smells faintly of lavender, iron, and roasted grain. Somewhere above, a bell tolls the hour. Below, the beer rests, alive, fermenting, awaiting its moment. And all around you, the nuns move in silence, laughter, and purpose, each step another stanza in a centuries-long brewing hymn. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythmic shuffle of footsteps and the faint gurgle of fermentation. There's something eternal about it. This patient waiting, this care and craftsmanship, this belief that even a humble beverage can be sacred if made with enough love. And maybe just a little mugwort. The cellar lingers behind you like a deep breath held too long, cool and shadowed, scented with oak and herbs. As you step into the upper corridor, light filters through narrow stained glass slits, casting soft swirls of amber and blue across the floor. It's easy to forget you're in a place that's part holy sanctuary, part industrial brewing operation. But then, a nun walks by with a stack of ledgers nearly as tall as her, muttering something about barley weights and the bishop's absurd tax again. And the illusion slips away, because if there's one thing medieval nuns were just as committed to as prayer and piety, it was paperwork. Today, you're headed to the scriptorium. Not to copy scriptures, no. You're here to witness a different kind of divine labor. The brewing records. You expect something informal, maybe doodled margins and guesswork numbers. What you find instead is a masterclass in medieval logistics. Sister Theodrata greets you with a quill tucked behind one ear and ink-stained fingers. She doesn't look up as she flips through parchment after parchment of brewing entries, her expression unreadable save for the occasional twitch of her eyebrow whenever she spots a miscalculation. The scriptorium is silent except for the soft scratch of quills and the occasional sigh of someone grappling with Latin math. Here, brewing is a science. Every bushel of malted barley, every scoop of dried yarrow, every hour of fermentation, documented, balanced, and cross-referenced. The nuns even track how certain herbs affect the shelf life, taste, and, occasionally, the temperaments of the visiting monks. One note, you notice, simply reads, "Too much tansy." Father Ulrich sang until matins. But it's not just meticulous bookkeeping that makes these records fascinating. It's the way they blur the lines between sacred duty and subtle rebellion. Historians still argue whether these brewing logs were officially sanctioned by church authorities or quietly tolerated. Brewing wasn't always welcomed as a religious pursuit, especially for women. Some bishops believed nuns should be praying, not peddling pints. But others, seeing the profits flow in and the local sick cared for with the proceeds, looked the other way. And so the scriptorium became both sanctuary and strategy room. You lean closer to one set of entries marked with an odd zigzag. Sister Theodrata explains, without looking up, that it's the convent's internal code for a swap batch. When grain was scarce or the taxman too greedy, they'd mix in root vegetables or acorns, sometimes even dried peas. The result was not always pleasant. One line reads, "Taste, penitential. Likely Lenten use only." A soft chuckle rises from the far desk. Another sister waves a parchment at you. "This one's from the frost year," she says. "Had to brew with what we could find." One nun swore adding roasted chestnuts would make it taste like heaven. It didn't. But even in failure, they documented everything. There's a real sense here that brewing wasn't just a chore. It was an intellectual pursuit. Recipes were tested, theories debated. One entry from the late 1100s speculates that soaking malt longer might create a smoother flavor, though another marginal note argues that smoother isn't holier. In the margins, someone has drawn a frowning barley stalk. Even more fascinating, the sisters seem to have conducted taste tests. There's a recurring phrase in the margins, "satis dulcis," or "sweet enough," followed by cryptic notes like, "Sister Petra disagrees, but she always does." One page has a list of brew strength rankings, accompanied by tiny faces, some smiling, some faintly nauseous. Among all this precision, you spot something stranger. A list of dreams. Yes, actual nighttime dreams. Apparently, once a month, the nuns shared what they dreamed after drinking a particular brew. Most are mundane visions of gardens, babies, wandering donkeys, but a few are oddly mystical. One describes a choir of birds that sing psalms. Another, a fish speaks and offers advice on barley. Theologians may scoff, but here in the convent, dreams matter. They're little signs from God, or maybe just warnings not to overdo the mugwort. You realize then that brewing wasn't separate from spiritual life, it was interwoven. Just as psalms were sung to calm the mind, the act of grinding grain and boiling wort was also a prayer of sorts. A way to serve, a way to contribute, a way to quietly assert value in a world that didn't always value them. One parchment, yellowed with age, simply reads, "Brewed for the orphan's table. May it bring strength." It's not grand, it's not poetic, but it carries weight. And let's not forget, money mattered too. The convent brewed not just for themselves, but for pilgrims, travelers, and occasionally the bishop's feasts. They charged modestly, yes, but consistently, and that meant income, which meant autonomy, which for medieval women was rare and precious. Still, scholars debate whether this economic freedom gave nuns true independence. Were they empowered, or just tolerated as long as the coin kept flowing? Did the church support their skill or simply exploit it? No easy answers, but the ledgers don't lie. And as Sister Theodrata finally looks up, just once, to say, "Don't touch the ink, it bites," you realize that for all their quiet demeanor, these nuns were running an empire, not with swords or sermons, but with yeast, grain, and fiercely accurate math. You step away, the soft crackle of parchment still echoing in your ears. As you pass back into the hallway, you can hear the distant hum of brewing again. Murmured prayers, the clink of tools, the heartbeat of the convent continuing on. You glance back toward the scriptorium door, now closed. You'll dream of numbers tonight, of curled ink and barley equations, and of a group of women who brewed not just beer, but a quiet kind of revolution. Outside, the garden path crunches softly under your feet. The afternoon sun dapples through the fig trees, casting shadows like lace across the packed earth. A few bees hover lazily around the lavender patch, and somewhere nearby, a hen is making a dramatic fuss over absolutely nothing. You pause at a small wooden bench tucked beneath a crooked pear tree. From here, you can see the low stone buildings of the convent brewery. Modest in scale, but bustling with life and purpose. Today, you're heading to a quieter corner of this operation. The herbarium. This is where the nuns experiment. You'd think beer would be a straightforward affair, water, grain, maybe some hops if you're lucky, but not here. Not with these sisters. Here, brewing is closer to alchemy. The herbarium is both garden and lab. Rows of raised beds contain not just common brewing herbs like groot, yarrow, and bog myrtle, but also stranger flora, wormwood, anise, sweet woodruff, all meticulously labeled in neat Latin and vernacular. Sister Gertrudis, who runs the place, greets you with dirt on her nose and a grin that suggests she hasn't had a nap since Epiphany. She hands you a small pouch. "Smell this," she says. "This mugwort, bitter, almost metallic. Good for dreams," she adds, then winks. "Or nightmares. Depends who drinks it." This is the kind of herbal knowledge that nuns passed from generation to generation. Not written down in official records, but murmured over simmering pots and shared during evening walks. Brewing wasn't just about alcohol, it was medicine, mood, and mystery. Historians still argue whether the use of herbs in convent brewing was intentional or just accidental preservation of older folk traditions. Some claim the nuns drew on ancient Roman and pre-Christian recipes. Others believe it was born from necessity. After all, hops were expensive and not always available, especially in isolated regions. So the sisters turned to their gardens and their memories. You follow Sister Gertrudis as she points out her favorites. Sweet Gale keeps the beer light and heady. Meadowsweet smells divine but spoils fast in heat. And this, she gestures to a spiky cluster of dried catmint, makes everyone very cheerful, sometimes too cheerful. She tells you stories as she works, how they once added rosemary to a celebratory batch and half the convent claimed visions of flying angels or indigestion. It was never confirmed. How the bishop forbade wormwood after an unfortunate bout of ecstatic poetry in the novices' dormitory. And how, on especially cold nights, they'd sneak a little extra ginger into the brew to warm the soul. You're beginning to understand that flavor wasn't the only goal. The herbs chosen often had symbolic meaning. Juniper for protection, sage for wisdom, marjoram for peace. Brewing became a form of coded prayer, drinkable blessings tucked into every cup. But this experimentation came with risks. Some batches turned out unpalatable. Others, unpredictably strong. One legendary brew, the Michaelmas Special, was so potent that it caused two sisters to miss an entire day of prayers and claim they'd met Saint Bridget in the stable. Records note that the recipe was set aside for festivals only. Still, the sisters kept at it. Their knowledge wasn't static, it evolved. You see evidence of this in a weathered leather-bound book Sister Gertrudis lets you peek into. It's not quite a grimoire, but it flirts with the idea. Annotated recipes, notes on boiling times, comments on taste, potency, and peculiar side effects. Some pages are marked with little skulls, mostly decorative, you hope. One is simply labeled "Never Again." Yet what's striking is the precision. They tested, tasted, adjusted. These were no amateurs playing with herbs, they were scientists in habits. Quiet innovators in a world that didn't expect women to innovate at all. You wonder aloud how they knew what worked. Sister Gertrudis just laughs. Trial, error, and prayer, she says. A lot of prayer. A breeze stirs the herb beds, releasing a sleepy perfume into the air. You breathe it in, clary sage, lemon balm, maybe a hint of elderflower, and feel suddenly very drowsy. No wonder the sisters always looked serene. As you sit beneath the pear tree again, watching the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional flutter of a bird in the branches, it occurs to you that this part of the convent, the fragrant, whispered, deeply feminine science of brewing, might be its quietest act of rebellion, a reclaiming of knowledge, a weaving of spiritual care into something utterly physical. Historians debate how much of this was intentional empowerment versus simple survival. Did the nuns know they were subverting gender roles by excelling at what was largely a male-dominated craft? Or were they just doing what needed to be done, instinctively folding care, competence, and creativity into every ale-stained recipe? Hard to say. And maybe it doesn't matter, because here, in this fragrant corner of the world, the beer wasn't just beer. It was a potion of peace, a brew of benevolence, a quiet testament to what happened when women were given time, tools, and just enough freedom to experiment. You hear the bell for Vespers toll in the distance. Time slips softly forward, like malt steeping in warm water. You rise, brush herb crumbs from your lap, and smile. You'll dream sweet tonight. You slip back inside, just as the shadows lengthen across the courtyard and a light mist begins to gather over the stone walls. The evening bell has already rung, and supper is done. Simple fare, you'd imagine. Maybe lentil stew with a heel of brown bread, and just a spoonful of that last batch of plum conserve that everyone's been pretending to forget about. The air is cooler now, tinged with damp earth, old wood, and the faint yeasty perfume that's become the backdrop to your time here. Tonight, you're heading to the brewing cellars. Not for work, though. For storage and secrets. Most convent breweries kept their barrels below ground, not only to control temperature but also to keep them undisturbed, away from light, mice, and the occasional overenthusiastic novice. You descend a steep stone stairwell, running your hand along the cool, pocked wall, until you reach a low, vaulted chamber. Rows of barrels stretch out before you like sleeping giants. Candlelight flickers along their rounded flanks, casting distorted halos on the curved ceiling. Here, Sister Apollonia keeps watch. She's older, soft-spoken, and moves like someone who remembers a time before the abbess was born. She's already waiting for you, sitting on a stool with a worn cloth in her lap, polishing a set of tasting ladles like they're relics. "Mind your head," she murmurs, gesturing toward a beam that looks exactly the right height to ruin your evening. You duck, barely. This part of the convent is quiet. Too quiet, and yet somehow alive. The barrels creak faintly. Somewhere something drips. You can almost hear the beer breathing. Sister Apollonia gestures to a small barrel tucked in the corner. "That one's from the St. Catherine's feast batch," she says. "Too much coriander." Some of the sisters liked it, but I think it tastes like soap. She pulls out a narrow wooden plug from the top of another cask and dips a ladle in. You take a sip. It's cool, earthy, a little sour. Not bad, but not quite like anything you've had before. She watches your face and smirks. We call that one the abbess's regret. She insisted on wild yeast. Never again. The thing is, brewing at scale, even small convent scale, isn't easy. Fermentation is a finicky process. A batch might be perfect 1 week and undrinkable the next. Temperature, humidity, barrel condition, the mood of the yeast, all could influence the final product. And because nuns weren't always allowed access to the same resources as monks, they often had to get creative. Some records suggest they repurposed old wine casks, clay amphorae, and even reused sheep bladders as strainers. Historians still argue whether these improvisations led to uniquely flavored beers or were simply health hazards with holy branding. Either way, the nuns drank them. More interesting, though, is what they did with the surplus. Yes, beer was made for the sisters, for guests, and sometimes for nearby parishes. But occasionally, there was extra. And here's where things get a little hush-hush. Because, strictly speaking, nuns weren't supposed to sell beer commercially. That was often reserved for male monasteries. And yet, some convents found clever ways around that little restriction. Sister Apollonia leans in conspiratorially. A few barrels went missing once, she says. Found their way into a merchant's wagon. And the merchant? He found his way into our chapel donation box. She raises an eyebrow. Miraculous, really? These whispered arrangements weren't always about money. Sometimes it was barter. A cask of strong ale in exchange for new linens, or exotic spices from a passing trader. One particularly bold convent in Flanders was rumored to trade their signature brew for fresh Italian lemons each spring. And you better believe they put those lemons to good use. Of course, there were risks. Not all abbesses approved. And the local bishop? He was usually of two minds, unofficially impressed, officially scandalized. Records exist of warnings issued to convents for improper commerce and unladylike ambition. But enforcement was sporadic. After all, what bishop wants to be known as the man who shut down the nuns' beer? It's possible that some of the most famous medieval Alesh weren't from monks at all, but from these shadowy corners, aged in cool cellars under silent stone. You ask Sister Apollonia how much of this is true, and she just shrugs. Depends who's asking. She lights another candle and begins to wipe down a dusty bottle in the far corner. Hand-blown glass, sealed with wax, and labeled in a script so old it looks like it belongs in a museum. We only open these on Jubilee years, she says. Or if the abbess has a really bad day. You wonder what forgotten recipes lie sealed in glass down here. Beer aged for decades, infused with herbs no longer grown. Forgotten techniques. Tastes no one's tongue remembers. It's like stepping into a time capsule that smells faintly of cloves and damp oak. And here's a thought. If a convent barrel rolled out of sight, and no one was around to see it, did it become a sin? Or just an excellent vintage? Historians debate whether these quiet cellar dealings were widespread or rare exceptions. But what they all agree on is this. Nuns knew what they were doing. These weren't happy accidents. This was controlled craft, sometimes disguised, sometimes denied, but always present. The candle flickers, the cellar sighs, and Sister Apollonia smiles at you with the calm of someone who has outlived every rulebook. You thank her, bow your head to avoid the beam again, and begin the slow climb back to the world above. Your legs are a bit heavier now. Maybe it's the stairs. Maybe it's the ale. Either way, the evening has shifted into that peculiar stillness where stories settle like dust, and truth blends quietly into legend. You emerge from the cellar with a soft creak of the door behind you, stepping back into the stone hallway where the scent of old yeast fades into cool, damp stone and faint traces of lavender oil. The night has truly set in now. Outside, the last of the golden sky has slipped into indigo, and the distant hoot of an owl tells you that even the mice are making smarter decisions than you, wandering around at this hour. You pass a group of novices murmuring evening prayers in the chapel alcove, their voices like water gently trickling over old stone. And for a moment, everything feels still, timeless, suspended in the hush that wraps medieval life like a woolen cloak. But you've got one more stop tonight, the convent's herbarium. Now, you wouldn't normally associate herbs with brewing, unless you've had one of those aggressively botanical IPAs that taste like someone soaked a pine cone in gin. But medieval nuns? Oh, they were herb geniuses. Their gardens were laboratories, pharmacies, pantries, and yes, breweries. You ease open the wooden gate and step into the small courtyard garden. It's dark, but you can still make out neat rows of plants, carefully labeled with wooden tags. Chamomile, marjoram, hyssop, bog myrtle, some of them more useful than tasty. A cat slinks between the hedges like it owns the place, probably because it does. You nod to it. It ignores you. In the far corner, under a canvas awning strung with drying bundles of herbs, Sister Ludwiga is at work. She's tall, all elbows and stern glances, and currently grinding something that smells faintly of citrus and dust. Juniper, she mutters before you ask. Makes the beer cleaner. Cuts the funk. You'd heard that before. Many convent brewers were also apothecaries. The line between beer and medicine was often blurry. Hops, which we now think of as essential to beer, weren't always used. In fact, they were controversial. Monks liked them because they preserved beer longer and added a bitter tang. Nuns, on the other hand, sometimes preferred the older herb mixtures called grut, which could include anything from yarrow to mugwort to, well, things that probably shouldn't have been in a beverage. Historians still argue whether the choice of herbs reflected taste or theology, Sister Ludwiga says without looking up. But we all know it was mostly just what grew well in the garden. And it's true, herbal gruts were hyperlocal, based on what the soil and seasons allowed. One convent's beer might be sharp with rosemary and thyme, while another's tasted of sweet gale and sage. Some batches were intentionally calming, lavender, chamomile, especially for the elderly sisters or during Lent. Others were stimulating. There's a record of one Polish abbey that made vigorous brew for long night vigils. The recipe included pepper, cinnamon, and something that may or may not have been ground-up beetles. Details are fuzzy and hopefully extinct. Sister Ludwiga gestures to a low wooden table covered in parchment scraps and hand-inked sketches. These are recipe records, not neatly kept, mind you. Just clusters of notes, half in Latin, half in that distinctly hard-to-read nun cursive, with little side comments like less lemon balm this time or Sister Gertrude's rash, never again. You run your fingers along the margins of one. A little ink sketch shows a smiling sun and, below it, a frothy mug. That's one of mine, she says. Only for feast days, not for penance. One of the reasons these herbal blends were so prized was because they gave nuns control not just over the flavor but the mood. Remember, these were cloistered communities. Life was predictable, rhythmic. A well-timed, gently spiced beer wasn't just a drink. It was a moment of variation, a shift in tone, something unexpected in a world where surprises were few and often unwelcome. And it wasn't just internal use either. Some convents were known to provide healing beers to the local community. Low-alcohol, herbal-infused brews that were closer to tinctures. They claimed to ease digestion, calm the nerves, and even assist in marital cooperation. We'll let you interpret that however you like. Not everything was about flavor, Sister Ludwiga adds, tucking a wisp of gray hair back under her veil. Some of these herbs were prayers in plant form, which is oddly beautiful when you think about it. That every cup brewed wasn't just sustenance or routine, but intention. A sip that held meaning beyond the palate. She lifts a clay pot and offers you a whiff. It's pungent, sharp, and earthy. For winter Alesh, she says. Warms the belly and the soul. Also clears the sinuses. You cough a little. She grins. As you look around the garden, the intertwining of brewing and botany becomes clearer. Here's the culinary arm of theology. Taste as metaphor, spice as virtue, bitter as a reminder that even joy should be tempered. The nuns didn't just make beer. They infused it with worldview. And that's something that modern microbreweries, with their ironic names and limited batches, might appreciate more than they know. Because for all our stainless steel and temperature controls, we're still chasing the same thing these nuns were. A drink that tells a story, that anchors us in a place and a moment and a feeling. You glance back at the drying bundles, sage and savory, perhaps something more mysterious, and wonder which brew those will become next. Maybe something celebratory. Maybe something contemplative. Or maybe just something to sip slowly while watching the first snow of December fall past the convent window. The cat reappears and brushes your leg, unimpressed by your musings. Sister Ludwiga chuckles. She only comes around when it's almost midnight, and with that, you step out of the herbarium, leaving behind a world of dried petals, ancient recipes, and whispers in the scent of time. You return to the cloister walk, your shoes softly brushing the worn flagstones, the herbal scent still clinging faintly to your robe like a souvenir from another world. The convent is quieter now. The bells have long stopped tolling, and the hum of communal prayers has faded to a silence so complete you can hear your own breath echo against the walls. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, someone's snoring gently. It's probably Sister Margarita. You're told her nighttime rumblings are legendary, capable of rattling pews. You drift past the refectory and duck into a smaller chamber, candlelit and cozy, where 3 older nuns are seated around a large ledger. Their faces are drawn but kind, brows furrowed in what looks like the quiet intensity of accounting. You've just stumbled upon something crucial, something that separates the decent brewers from the remarkable ones. The brewing logs. Medieval brewing wasn't just about intuition. It was also about record-keeping, in an age where ink was precious and parchment didn't grow on trees. Well, it sort of did, but you know what we mean. These brewing records were the secret weapons of the nuns. They weren't merely noting ingredients, they were documenting weather, fermentation days, water clarity, batch sizes, the mood of the yeast, and, occasionally, whether Sister Agnes had sneezed in the wort again. One of the nuns notices you and smiles, sliding the ledger your way. It's older than the convent cat, the leather brittle and cracking at the corners, but it opens like it's been used every week for 2 centuries. Inside, the handwriting changes with every few pages. Some neat and angular, others sprawling and a little dramatic, like the author was writing with flair and flourishes between baking loaves or translating psalms. You trace a line with your finger. 3rd batch this Lent, too cloudy, possibly due to low barley roasting. Sister Alma says it's the cursed wind. Classic Alma, blaming the breeze. Another entry, this one accented with a tiny sketch of a loaf of bread. Paired this ale with rye biscuits, caused hiccups in choir rehearsal. Reduce honey. These records weren't just recipes, they were living journals of brewing as daily life. The kinds of notes you'd scribble on your fridge today, don't buy that almond milk again, or add more chili next time, but not that much. But in this case, it's about how best to ferment barley in a cold drafty room where the walls weep with condensation and the firewood is damp. It gets more interesting the deeper you go. There's an entire section devoted to what the convent called seasonal deviations. Brewing, after all, is notoriously temperamental, and medieval tools weren't exactly precision instruments. A summer ale fermented too long might get sour. A winter batch might barely ferment at all. Some nuns took it upon themselves to become weather watchers, reading the sky, charting the stars, even praying to particular saints for ideal brewing conditions. One note reads, Feast of St. Cuthbert, skies clear, barley plump, favorable for tomorrow's mash. Historians still argue whether these logs represent science or superstition. Was it empirical observation, a primitive form of meteorology, or just a convent full of women determined to blame their brewing fails on a grumpy celestial patron? But for you, reading these entries by flickering candlelight, they feel like something else entirely. Stubborn, precise love. Brewing wasn't just a chore. It was an art, a science, and most importantly, a form of devotion. These women recorded every nuance not because they were obligated to, but because they cared deeply about the result. Not for ego, not for commerce, but for community. You ask softly if any of these logs were ever shared with the outside world. One of the sisters raises an eyebrow like you just asked if they give away their best bread recipe. Some were, she finally replies, but most stayed here. This is family history, and truly it is. The margin notes hint at jokes you'll never understand. Don't let Sister Emma near the fermenter again, one entry warns. Was she clumsy? Curious? Prone to confusing buckets? Another line simply says, Frothy miracle today. No explanation. Make of that what you will. Occasionally, they experimented. That's right, medieval nuns were tinkerers. There are side sections where someone tried brewing with chestnuts instead of grain. Another tested honey infusion techniques. Too sweet, the verdict scrawled beside it. Sister Hildegard called it syrup of sin. You can't help but laugh a little at that, which draws another amused glance from the nuns. One of them shrugs. We don't brew like that anymore, of course. Not since the abbess declared the syrup experiment unholy. It's worth noting that beer wasn't always the endgame. Sometimes the process was the point. Long fermentation days could be contemplative, rhythmic, spiritual. Like prayer, but with a thermometer. Well, if they'd had thermometers. What they had instead was instinct, observation, and a near-mystical sense of timing passed down nun to nun. In the back pages, you find a rare oddity. A small map of the brewing cellar, drawn with playful inaccuracy. One corner is labeled Haunted by Brother Francis. Even though, technically, there were no brothers in this convent. Unless they meant the occasional monk visitor. Or maybe a rat with a certain swagger. Beside that sketch, a final entry in a different hand, likely more modern. May our sisters' brews live on, in taste, in memory, and in joy. You close the book carefully, suddenly aware of how much history you're holding. Not the grand battles and kings sort of history, but something quieter, homelier, and in many ways more honest. These weren't women setting out to be legends. They were caretakers of routines, of flavor, of care. Their legacy isn't statues or cathedrals, but perhaps a perfectly balanced ale on a cold evening, or the memory of a good joke scribbled beside a recipe for beer that once made the whole convent giggle. As you stand and stretch, the candles flicker, as if the room itself exhales. You thank the sisters and step out into the hallway once more. The air feels cooler now, touched with the faint scent of barley and ink. And just like that, you continue your journey deeper into the lives of these quietly remarkable brewers of the cloth. You follow the stone corridor until the air thickens again with warmth and an unmistakable yeasty tang that rises up and kisses your nose like sourdough in mid-prove. The brewing chamber, yes, the brewing chamber, is tucked behind a heavy wooden door that creaks open with the drama of a church confession. It's dim in here, but inviting, with flickers of firelight dancing on copper kettles and large barrels stained from decades of devotion. You've officially entered the heart of convent brewing. And make no mistake, this is not some rustic side project. It's a full-blown operation. You blink slowly, adjusting to the amberlit space, and realize just how serious the sisters are about their craft. Barrels are neatly aligned, kettles gleam, as much as anything medieval ever gleamed, and everything smells faintly like warm cereal and old prayers. You half expect a choir of yeast cells to burst into Latin chant. One sister waves you over to the mash tun, where a bubbling, porridge-like mixture releases steam in gentle clouds. This is the mash, the first real stage of the beer-making ritual. Crushed malted grains mixed with hot water to convert starches into sugar. You lean in, and it's like peering into a cauldron of comfort. The scent alone could probably cure seasonal depression. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval mash tuns, like the one you're staring into now, were often made of wood or clay, and maintaining consistent heat was a challenge. Hence the sister hovering nearby, gently stirring the contents with a carved paddle the size of a canoe. Or she looks serene, almost smug. She's clearly mastered the patience and wrist strength of a pro. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Ever heard of the bishop's finger test? Before thermometers, brewers would dip a clean finger, often a bishop's or more likely just someone important, into the mash. If it was too hot to hold there comfortably, it needed cooling. Not exactly FDA approved, but effective-ish. And yes, the irony of nuns using a bishop's imaginary finger to measure temperature is not lost on anyone. You ask, half-jokingly, if they still use that method. The sister smiles. Only when we want to blame someone else for burning the mash. The process is both sacred and bodily. You stir, you strain, you lift heavy sacks of grain and dump them with care. Every nun in here is involved. Brewing wasn't a hobby, it was a full-body sacrament. Even novices took part, often learning through whispered instruction or a stern glance that said, "No, Don't touch that valve unless you want the whole place to smell like socks. You move to the boiling kettle where the liquid, now called wort, is simmering with purpose. Hops, or sometimes local herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow, are added here. The aroma is sharper now, more medicinal, less porridge, and more earthy spice. This step sterilizes the brew and adds flavor and bitterness. Medieval nuns didn't always have hops available, especially early on, so they used what they could forage. The convent garden likely looked less like an herb plot and more like a magical apothecary that occasionally exploded. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how much autonomy these women truly had in crafting and modifying their beer. Some historians argue they were limited to women's tasks, confined to repeating inherited recipes without innovation. Others suggest the opposite, that convents, being self-contained and often relatively wealthy, gave nuns surprising freedom to experiment. After all, if you control the ingredients, the tools, and the distribution, who's stopping you from sneaking in a bit of elderflower just to see what happens? You watch one sister sprinkle something into a smaller vessel. When you ask, she says simply, "Secret." That's the thing. Many convents developed their own regional flavor, their signature taste. No two batches alike, and no two convents agreed on the perfect profile. Light, dark, bitter, fruity. Convent Alesh were as varied as the sisters who brewed them. At the far end of the room, a novice is ladling cooled wort into a tall container, readying it for fermentation. You peer inside, and the sticky, warm sweetness clings to the sides like molasses. It smells like breakfast, dessert, and a brisk walk through a barley field all at once. Then comes the yeast. In this era, yeast was less added and more welcomed. They didn't know the science, but they knew the magic. Convents had special wooden paddles or fermenting vats that harbored friendly wild yeasts, passed down like family heirlooms. If you cleaned them too well, you risked losing the entire character of the beer. So, ironically, a little filth preserved tradition. A sister hands you a lidded crock with reverence, whispering, "Starter." You nod solemnly. You have no idea what to do with it, but it feels important, like you've been entrusted with a living relic, something between a sourdough mother and the Holy Grail. You linger as the room quiets down, the brewing mostly done, the mash tun empty, the barrels sealed. There's a sense of pride here, but it's quiet, not showy. The kind of satisfaction that comes from doing something well and knowing that very few people outside these walls will ever understand how much went into it. It's not just beer. It's not even just devotion. It's continuity, a recipe stirred by hundreds of hands. A taste shaped by memory, faith, and weather. You're standing in the center of a centuries-old time loop, where barley and water and hope are combined in the exact same way they've always been, and somehow it still matters. You thank the sisters and turn back toward the corridor. The scent of hops trails you like perfume. Somewhere deep inside you, a very modern part of your brain whispers that you'd pay $12 for this in a microbrewery, and you wouldn't even complain. And then, as you close the door behind you, another thought nudges you awake. You're not even halfway through the day yet. You step back into the corridor, the scent of ale still clinging to your clothes like a whispered benediction. The stone underfoot feels cooler now, or maybe it's just your body coming down from the warmth of the brewing room. You move forward through a quieter part of the convent, past a cloister garden where lavender nods sleepily in the breeze, and toward another hum of activity. Less steamy, more rhythmic. You follow it like a sleepwalker drawn to a lullaby. You duck under an arched doorway into a room filled with tapping sounds and hushed conversation. This is the bottling and storing space, a dry chamber with shelves stacked high with glazed jugs, wooden casks, and, oddly, small scrolls of parchment labeled in delicate, looping Latin. These nuns weren't just brewing. They were tracking every batch like accountants of fermentation. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Monastic record-keeping was often meticulous, even for the more domestic tasks. Brew logs, quantities, dates, and comments on taste or quality were sometimes written down, especially in wealthier convents. While few of these specific ale records survive from nunneries, similar ones from male monasteries give us strong clues that the sisters likely did the same. One record you pass notes a batch as weaker than usual, but good for feast days. Another has only one ominous word: exploded. You don't ask. You watch as a sister seals a stoneware jug with beeswax, tilting it gently before setting it among dozens of others. The labeling process is neat, almost reverent. She's humming, off-key but soothing, and the song feels older than the building. You notice that each batch has a different colored ribbon around the neck, perhaps to distinguish recipes, or fermentation dates, or maybe just personal flair. Historians still argue whether these color codes were purely functional or symbolic, with some suggesting they denoted liturgical calendar use or medicinal strength. Others think the ribbons were just a sister's way of flexing her creative muscle. You reach for a jug labeled with a tiny drawing of a fish fasting beer. Yes, the medieval church allowed beer during fasting, and in some places it was encouraged. Liquid wasn't considered a violation of fasting rules, so if you were on a Lenten fast, your best bet for calories might be a hearty liquid bread ale. Nuns were adept at adjusting recipes accordingly, thicker, stronger, sometimes even spiced for extra energy. No offense to modern meal replacement shakes, but medieval nuns were way ahead of you. And here's the fringe tidbit of this chapter. Some convents brewed special alesh specifically for medicinal purposes, beers infused with herbs like sage, wormwood, or rosemary. These brews weren't made for pleasure but for healing. Think of it like a pint of NyQuil with holy water. And no, you won't find that in your local pub. You take a seat on an overturned barrel, watching as two novices argue gently over corking technique. The older sister supervising doesn't intervene. She just lets them bicker. You get the feeling the beer will be fine either way. But the lesson in patience? That's what she's really after. The storage room also houses failed experiments. Moldy casks, cracked pots, spoiled wort that smells like gym socks. There's a surprising amount of failure in this process, even for experts. But no one here seems ashamed of it. The nuns catalog even their failures with the same care as their successes, as if every mistake is just another footnote in their pursuit of perfection. You trail a sister into a connected chamber, the distribution area. This is where the beer leaves the convent walls. Large carts with barrels line the perimeter. Delivery routes were essential to a nunnery's income. Some convents sold their beer to surrounding villages, merchants, or even clergy. You're standing in the medieval equivalent of a loading dock. There's another scholarly debate that threads through this room like a draft. How much of the profits from convent brewing actually stayed with the nuns? Some argue they had control over earnings and reinvested them into convent life. Clothing, manuscript copying, better gardens. Others believe church oversight, usually male bishops, often siphoned off the income, leaving sisters with barely enough to maintain operations. In either case, brewing wasn't just sacred work, it was economic work. Necessary, strategic, and possibly the only way some nunneries avoided ruin. A novice rolls a small barrel toward the exit, struggling to keep it from tipping. A senior nun watches silently, then finally says, "Next time, roll from the bottom, not the side." The girl nods, cheeks pink, but grinning. Brewing wasn't just about beer. It was about discipline, observation, and yes, a little trial by spillage. You walk toward the back corner where a ledger sits open on a small desk. It tracks deliveries and payments, inked in cramped Latin abbreviations. Your eyes skim the entries. One marked, priestly ration. Another simply, feast beer, twice strength. It's a quiet record of generosity, barter, obligation, and a little mischief. A footnote catches your eye. No deliveries next week. Barrel sprung leak and stained the altar linens. You try not to laugh too loudly. Imagine explaining that to the bishop. It's hard not to be impressed by how thoroughly the nuns owned their process. From recipe to fermentation, from ladling mash to hauling barrels, they were brewers in every sense of the word. And because they were cloistered, they had to be everything. Chemists, merchants, mechanics, and sometimes even diplomats. If a local noble wanted stronger beer for his feast, someone had to negotiate that order without giving away the entire winter's supply. That someone was often a nun with ink-stained fingers and a no-nonsense tone. You walk back through the bottling room, careful not to trip over any tools or sleepy novices. The sisters are winding down. Bottles are labeled. Shelves are stocked. Jugs are cooled and humming quietly, as if content with their fermentation. The air is thick with effort and barley and the sense of a job done well, even if no one outside these walls will ever fully appreciate it. Just as you're about to leave the room, a sister taps you gently on the shoulder and hands you a tiny cup. It's warm. You take a sip. It's earthy, nutty, a little sharp. It tastes like the inside of the convent smells, like something old and intentional, brewed with care and a bit of cheeky daring. She smiles and says, "Not our best batch, but better than the bishop's." You nod solemnly. You're not sure if she means quality or alcohol content. Maybe both. You follow the narrow hallway away from the bottling chamber, the soft weight of that last sip still lingering on your tongue. The convent is quieter now, like the whole building is exhaling. Even the pigeons outside the window ledges seem to have called it a night. Your next steps take you past another archway and into a smaller room lit with just one oil lamp and a half-shuttered window. This is where the real behind-the-scenes magic happened. Not brewing or bottling, but writing, negotiating, and occasionally, outwitting those who underestimated cloistered women with nothing to lose and everything to document. This, friend, is the convent's scriptorium/ledger office, where brewing wasn't only a physical labor. It was a legal, financial, and, dare we say, political maneuver. These nuns didn't just brew for the joy of a foamy top. They brewed to survive, to negotiate power, to assert independence in a world that often refused to see women's work as anything but decorative embroidery or saintly martyrdom. You approach a desk, where a sister with ink-stained fingers is hunched over parchment, her quill scratching quietly in the dim. She's not writing a sermon. She's drafting a contract, one for a beer exchange with a neighboring priory. You notice the way she phrases the agreement. Exact quantities, delivery dates, and a little note stipulating the return of the barrels. She underlines it twice. Someone's been stiffed before. And here comes your mainstream historical fact. Though many nunneries were under spiritual oversight from bishops or male abbots, they often handled their own business affairs. Brewing, in particular, gave them a kind of soft leverage, especially when local communities relied on their beer. There are recorded cases of convents negotiating prices, setting production quotas, and even refusing to brew for certain lords if they hadn't fulfilled previous donations. A sister from the corner clears her throat and reads aloud from another document. "If the ale arrives warm again, we shall not accept it." Her voice is calm but unshakable. She's negotiating freshness like it's a matter of theology. And honestly, kind of is. This wasn't just beverage commerce, it was a moral, almost sacred contract between the maker and the drinker. Serve a spoiled brew, and it wasn't just bad business. It was bad karma. Here's your fringe tidbit of the evening. Some nuns used beer labels to subtly mark their discontent. One brewing order, possibly frustrated with delayed payments from clergy, began stamping their barrels with psalms about fairness and divine justice. Not exactly passive-aggressive, but close. A cask stamped with "Let justice roll down like waters" hits a little differently when you're 2 weeks late on payment. You settle onto a stool beside a wall shelf lined with ledgers. And here's where the scholarly arguments come in. Historians still argue whether these business roles were empowering in a feminist sense, or simply part of an overburdened workload forced upon nuns when male-run institutions wouldn't help them. Some see these brewing nuns as proto-entrepreneurs, thriving under restriction. Others suggest they were just plugging holes in broken systems. Cleverly, yes, but under compulsion. You get the feeling the truth lives somewhere in the inky margins. The sister beside you stretches her fingers and offers you a look. "Hard to get good parchment these days," she mutters. "Had to trade last week's hops surplus to the monks for some that wasn't covered in beetle holes." You nod sympathetically. The monk trade economy was more barter than capitalism. Goods, services, blessings, and yes, beer. You watch her switch quills and start a new page. This time, she's sketching something, what looks like a stylized wheat stalk with a halo around it. You blink. Is that Saint Arnold of Soissons, the patron saint of brewers? It is. She's designing a new seal. "Looks a bit smug," you whisper. She shrugs. "He always does. That's the thing, they knew their symbols. Saint Arnold, Saint Brigid, even the Virgin Mary sometimes appeared in brewery lore. Some convents claimed divine inspiration for their brewing success. Others framed it as an act of hospitality. offering safe drink to travelers and locals in a world where water could be, well, let's just say full of unwelcome surprises. A gust of wind tugs the shutters open, and you glimpse the moon rising. Another sister enters the room, holding a small crate of items, parchments, wax seals, even a little wooden stamp shaped like a bee. For the honey batch jugs, she explains, setting it down. Each item is treated like treasure, because in many ways it is. These were tools of survival. Branding before branding, packaging before mass marketing. The medieval nun knew her product. And here's something even stranger. Some convents brewed under what we'd now call private label deals. That's right. Other religious houses or towns might contract the nuns to make beer on their behalf, while putting a different abbey's name on it. You could call it outsourcing medieval edition. You lean back as another sister reads a letter from a neighboring town. It's a request urgent for our strongest and most agreeable batch, intended for a wedding celebration. She raises an eyebrow. Guess someone's hoping for cheerful in-laws. They all laugh. Not loudly, but warmly. That quiet, knowing kind of laugh that echoes in stone rooms and survives the centuries. As you glance around the room, it becomes clear that, for these women, brewing wasn't just science or spirituality. It was strategy. Every ounce measured, every coin tracked, every note recorded with the same reverence given to Scripture. Not because the beer itself was holy, but because the independence it gave them was. You look again at that little stylized saint on the parchment. Halo, tunic, barley stalk. His face may be smug, but he's perched on something sacred. A keg marked with the initials of the convent. Beneath it, in Latin, the words read, "Work humbly, brew wisely." The sisters aren't here to be remembered. They're here to endure. And this brew, this strange, barley-soaked testimony, is their way of doing it. You leave the ledger room behind, the faint scent of ink still clinging to your nostrils, and follow the gentle thrum of humming, barely more than a breath, down the corridor. The air shifts again as you pass through another threshold, and suddenly you're standing at the heart of the convent's refectory, the communal dining hall. Long wooden tables stretch across the stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of elbows, bowls, and sleepy heads resting in mid-prayer. Here's where the nuns took their meals, their ale, and occasionally, a moment to just be. No chants, no charts, just the warm slosh of a shared jug passed gently from hand to hand. What's more surprising is this. Beer wasn't merely for the brewmasters or the guests. It was part of the sisters' daily sustenance. In fact, many medieval nunneries provided each sister with a daily ration of beer, typically between 1 and 2 liters. And no, it wasn't some wild bacchanal. It was what's known as small beer, low in alcohol, high in nutrients, and far safer than the local stream. You sit at one of the benches, the wood creaking under your weight, and imagine the quiet routine. A bell rings, sandals shuffle in. A sister reads from Scripture while the rest chew their coarse bread and sip from earthenware cups. No chit-chat, just the sound of spoons, distant birdsong, and the occasional hiccup someone tries and fails to smother. And here's your mainstream historical fact for this chapter. During fasting periods, which took up to 40% of the calendar year in some orders, solid food was severely restricted. But, and here's the divine loophole, beer didn't count. Liquid nourishment, they called it. So beer became not only a staple, but a sneaky little indulgence during the long days of Lent, Advent, and every saint's feast that required some form of abstention. You reach for an imaginary cup, and in your mind's eye, it's warm, just slightly foamy, the barley giving it a nutty edge. It's not strong enough to get you tipsy, but just hearty enough to make you forget the meager bowl of turnip stew beside it. Now, let's drop in that lovely fringe fact. Some nunneries brewed seasonal alesh specifically for feast days. These were often richer, spiced, or sweetened with herbs, and saved for holy celebrations. St. Bridget's Day, honey beer. Easter, a floral blend with rosemary or marjoram. The good stuff saved for the holiest moods. There's even some evidence, though patchy, that certain convents brewed darker, richer alesh for older nuns who were too frail to eat solid food. Beer as a meal replacement? Honestly, could be worse. One sister near the back of the room lets out a delicate sneeze and wipes her nose with a linen scrap. Another nods sympathetically and hands over a warm stone bottle. Steamed ale with thyme. Maybe? Brewing wasn't just nourishment, it was medieval medicine. The herbs weren't just for flavor, they were part of an entire folk pharmacopoeia. Sage to soothe the throat. Yarrow for upset stomachs. Chamomile for those, more prayerful digestive issues. Here's where the scholarly debate pours in, slow and foamy. Historians still argue whether beer was truly a centerpiece of nunnery's internal life or just a convenient placeholder in monastic records. Some claim it was overemphasized by male scribes who couldn't resist poking fun at tipsy nuns. Others believe beer was a crucial part of female religious autonomy, taken seriously and reverently, with recipes passed down like psalms. You get the sense the truth's probably a little of both. Somewhere between satire and sacrament, there's a humble mug of ale that got someone through a hard fast, a cold evening, or a long reading from Leviticus. A younger sister shuffles into view carrying a tray of small clay cups. She notices you sitting there, watching, and gently places one in front of you. "Don't worry," she says, barely above a whisper. "It's the mild batch." You raise it in silent thanks, and she chuckles. Third tap on the left. "Never trust the one with the squirrel carved into it." Wait, squirrel? Yes? Apparently, some convents mark their barrels with little carvings, animals, stars, symbols of saints, to help keep track of flavor or potency. One nun's lamb barrel might be lighter than Sister Agnes's ominous owl cask. This makes you wonder. Did they ever prank each other with swap taps? Maybe once or twice. Another sister, older, with a face like weathered parchment, smiles from her corner seat. She's holding a rosary, but she's also nursing what looks like a well-earned brew. "We bless our work," she says, "and we drink our blessings." And just when you think this is the coziest it gets, she adds, "But don't get Sister Hilda drunk. She debates canon law when tipsy. We missed Vespers twice last Lent." You smile, content now to just sit in this moment. The sounds soften, barefoot steps, distant wind, a gentle whistle from the fire-heated stones. The refectory is not silent, but it is peaceful in that way old stone spaces can be. Like the air's been thickened by stories and seasons. Here, beer isn't rebellion or ritual. It's rhythm. A rhythm of care, of endurance, of women carving out agency with barrels, buckets, and yeast. You look down at the cup in your hands, imaginary maybe, but still warm. It tastes of barley and sisterhood and centuries. And just as you begin to feel the day's weight settle gently into your shoulders, the old sister looks over at you again. "Don't fall asleep yet," she winks. "You haven't seen the garden." You step outside with the faintest buzz of comfort in your belly. Not from alcohol, but from the sheer warmth of the scene you've just left. The convent garden unfurls before you like a patchwork quilt of green, gold, and soil-dark browns. And though it's not grand or meticulously sculpted like a royal courtyard, it carries that simple, lived-in beauty that only comes from women who know what plants want. Or maybe what they need. The scent hits first. Lemon balm, mugwort, hops vines stretching like lazy cats along the old stone walls, and somewhere, a soft trace of wormwood. Not a tourist's herb garden. This one, it's a brewer's haven. See, the thing is, medieval convents didn't just brew beer, they grew beer. Or at least the ingredients. And they did it with an almost stubborn pride. You spot rows of barley shimmering in the breeze, small clutches of coriander, and tall stalks of fennel swaying like sleepy sentries at the edge of the world. And just when you think you've seen everything, a squat little building emerges from behind a hedgerow. It's built low, with a mossy roof and soot-darkened chimney. Inside, the garden brewery. Yes, some nunneries had entirely separate brewing huts tucked away on the grounds, sometimes to hide the heat, sometimes to keep the smell from soaking into the chapel's vestments. You duck inside, inhaling a wave of yeasty sweetness and warm wood. The air is thick with history and hops. This is where Sister Else might have stood, sleeves rolled up, whispering Psalm 23 while skimming the scum from the top of a gently boiling pot. Where Sister Gertrude, elbow-deep in grain sacks, might have cracked a joke about the angel Gabriel not showing up unless the wort was just right. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of the same herbs and flowers grown in convent gardens were used not only for brewing, but for medicine, dye, and food. Hops, for instance, weren't widely used in beer until around the 11th or 12th centuries, and even then it was often women, nuns included, who led the charge in experimenting with the new ingredient. Before hops, grut, an herbal mix that varied by region, think bog myrtle, yarrow, and mugwort. Earthy, fragrant, and sometimes a bit trippy. You reach out to brush a drying bundle of herbs strung along a low beam. One smells like mint, another like hay, and the third? Possibly marigold, though your modern nose can't quite place it. The brewing hut is small, but every surface hums with intention. Clay bottles wait patiently in a crate. A wooden paddle leans against the hearth. A copper kettle rests over long-dead embers. Even now, centuries later, it smells alive. Like comfort, like effort, like care. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some nuns inscribed prayers or protective charms onto the inside of their fermentation barrels. Latin blessings etched in charcoal, or symbols carved under the lid to ward off spoilage. Fermentation wasn't just chemistry, it was faith, and maybe just a sprinkle of superstition. One historian, very serious chap, you imagine him adjusting his spectacles in candlelight, insists that these charms were purely ornamental. Another swears they were sincere attempts to coax divine favor into every barrel. Historians still argue whether these markings were ritual protection or merely decorative tradition, but you can't help picturing a nun in the twilight hours, mumbling an Ave Maria while drawing a small fish symbol beneath the rim of a keg. You turn, and there's Sister Johanna, sitting on an overturned bucket near the door, shelling dried hops into a basket. You know, she says in a voice like velvet and dust, a good beer needs patience, just like prayer. You nod. She tosses you a little hop cone. You squeeze it gently. It's papery, aromatic, and sticky with resin. She smiles. And don't believe Brother Martin when he says we can't brew better than the monks. He fainted last time he tried our Easter special. Outside, the sun dips behind the convent's stone archways. The garden glows, golden and calm. You walk the rows slowly now, letting your fingers brush across thyme and lavender. Not just for brewing. These herbs also went into tonics, teas, poultices, and on rare occasion, into experimental batches Sister Catherine called Restful Alish. Some were said to help with sleep, others with nerves, and one, if local gossip is to be believed, could get even the prioress giggling before Compline. One more debate for the ages. Were nun brewers respected as medical experts because of their herbal knowledge, or were they simply playing the role assigned to them by monastic life? Some say they were proto-pharmacists. Others argue they were just filling gaps left by male clergy who weren't interested in women's work. Either way, those dusty herb journals and margin-scribbled recipes suggest one thing. They knew what they were doing. The final path through the garden bends beneath a willow, and as you pass under, the wind rustles the branches like soft chimes. You stop, breathe, listen. Somewhere behind you, a soft clink. A barrel settling into place. A bird chirping above the hops trellis. And maybe, just maybe, a chuckle from a ghostly nun who's proud of her last batch. The convent isn't a place of silence. Really, it's a place of layers. Of effort and quiet rebellion. Of ritual and rest. And yes, of really, really good beer. You settle onto a bench near the old well, letting the scent of lemon verbena drift up. The sun is gone now, but the air still holds its warmth. This is the end of the day. The nuns will soon be lighting candles for evening prayers. But you're already sinking, slowly, into the soft earth of the past, and the soft quiet of now. Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into a place where the cold is so bone deep, your nose might consider resigning from your face. You're standing on a wind-whipped stretch of Arctic tundra, somewhere near the top of the world. The snow is blinding, almost glowing under a merciless sun that's been hovering above the horizon for what feels like weeks. There's no shade, no shelter, just light bouncing off every icy surface like nature's own interrogation lamp. You pull the hood of your parka tighter, but your eyes are still watering, stinging, as if they're under attack. It's here, in this place where the sunlight doesn't warm but wounds, that humanity quietly invented something brilliant, something that could spare your vision, your sanity, and maybe even your life. Not a fancy pair of Ray-Bans, not aviators, just a slim piece of carved antler with two precise little slits. The world's first sunglasses. And you probably won't survive this frozen landscape without them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the ice, feet crunching against layers of snowpack that have outlived empires. There's no color out here, just white, blue, and the kind of blinding brightness that makes you feel like you've walked into a dentist's light fixture. The cold stings at your cheeks, but it's your eyes that really suffer. Each blink feels raw. There's a term for it, snow blindness, a kind of ultraviolet sunburn on your corneas. Cute, right? This isn't just an Arctic inconvenience. It's a full-on disability in regions where visibility could mean the difference between catching dinner and becoming it. And before modern medicine had names for it, indigenous Arctic peoples had already built a defense. Historians still argue whether the snow goggles were invented out of pure trial and error or whether they were inspired by the squint of a seasoned hunter, but either way, they worked. Better than you'd expect, honestly. Your hands fumble inside your fur-lined satchel and pull out a curved strip of antler, just wide enough to cover your eyes. Two narrow slits run across the front. You tie it around your head and instantly, miraculously, the glare vanishes. You can see again, not perfectly, but enough. It's like adjusting your screen brightness after sitting in the sun. Your head stops pounding. Your stomach unkinks. You don't feel quite so feral anymore. These snow goggles, called ilgok or igok in some dialects, were no fashion statement. They were survival tools honed by necessity. Some were carved from driftwood, others from ivory. The slits weren't just for show. They reduced the amount of light entering the eye and even sharpened visual acuity in bright conditions. Not unlike the pinhole effect of modern photography. They didn't block UV rays in the way polycarbonate lenses do today, but they limited exposure dramatically. The narrow horizontal slits forced you to focus and made it easier to spot contrast in the snow. That could mean identifying a crack in sea ice, or seeing a polar bear a few seconds earlier than it sees you. Of course, wearing them meant you had to move a bit differently. Less peripheral vision, more deliberate steps. Kind of like putting blinders on a horse, but the alternative was walking blind into a glacier. And no one wants that obituary. One popular misconception is that the Inuit lived in perpetual darkness. Not true. In spring and summer, daylight lasts for weeks at a time. During those endless sunny stretches, the UV rays bouncing off the ice are merciless. You can't close your eyes forever. Not if you're out hunting seals or navigating across miles of tundra. The snow goggles weren't a convenience. They were a revolution. There's a quiet elegance to the design. No moving parts, no screws, just a single piece of natural material, shaped by hand and intuition. The best ones were polished smooth on the inside to sit gently against the face, and sometimes soot was added around the slits to cut glare even further, like a proto-eyeliner for the survivalist. And here's a delightful little oddity. Some ancient goggles were decorated. Carvings along the edges, tiny patterns etched with bone tools. Historians still argue whether these designs were functional, grip texture, perhaps, or purely aesthetic. But let's face it, even when fighting for survival, humans can't resist a little flair. The earliest surviving examples have been dated back over 2,000 years. Imagine that. Before the Roman Empire rose and fell. Before paper was a thing in Europe. While people in the Mediterranean were still debating which god to sacrifice a goat to, Inuit engineers were already solving one of the most aggressive optical hazards on Earth with bone and patience. You duck your head as a gust of icy wind slices across the plain. Your breath fogs in front of you, and for a moment, all you hear is the faint hiss of snow shifting in drifts. But your eyes, your blessed, shaded eyes, can still see. The horizon is clear. You can make out the jagged line of ice blocks marking your route back to shelter. And here's the wildest part. This brilliant, protective tool existed for centuries before modern cultures thought to replicate it. While Europeans were still squinting into the sun or smearing their eyes with various herbs, the Inuit had already cracked the code on vision protection. And they did it with 0 degrees Celsius and 0 degrees of ego. You step inside the igloo, ducking low to keep from smacking your forehead on the arched entrance. The temperature difference is immediate. Outside, your breath practically froze midair. In here, it's surprisingly warm, well, relatively speaking. The air smells faintly of seal oil and packed snow, and there's a soft orange glow from a burning kullik, a shallow stone lamp fed with blubber. In the cozy hush, you sit down beside an elder who's scraping a strip of caribou antler with a flint blade. His hands are calloused and deliberate. You realize, watching him work, that what you hold in your hand, your snow goggles, isn't some primitive object. It's the product of generations of trial, refinement, and intuition. You're looking at ancient design thinking in action. No YouTube tutorials, no patents, just centuries of, what if we try this instead? The elder measures by eye alone, using nothing but his fingers to judge width, depth, curve. He carves 2 slits so narrow they look almost too small to see through. Yet, once the piece is sanded and tied across the face, you understand. The slits are perfectly aligned with your line of sight. It's like someone fine-tuned this tool for your skull. In this moment, you are not a modern bystander. You are part of a lineage of Arctic knowledge. This isn't just eyewear. It's a cultural artifact passed down from a people who outwitted one of Earth's harshest climates. Historians still argue whether the earliest goggles were worn by necessity or whether they carried ceremonial significance too. Some archaeologists think certain designs were worn only by hunters or elders. Others believe they were everyday objects that gained spiritual meaning through use, kind of like how a soldier's boots become sacred not because of what they are, but where they've walked. You run your gloved fingers along the polished surface of your goggles. Some are made from driftwood, yes, but others from baleen, the flexible part of a whale's mouth, sinew, or even walrus ivory. The material often depended on the geography. And geography was everything in the Arctic. If you lived near the sea, you used what washed up. Inland, you carved from bone and antler. And while modern fashion changes faster than you can say runway, these goggles were consistent across thousands of miles. Slight variations, sure, some had straight slits, others curved, but the basic structure remained the same. That's rare. It means the design was efficient enough not to require reinvention. Like the wheel, or the spoon, or peanut butter. As you sit cross-legged in that glowing igloo, listening to the faint crackle of fire on blubber, you notice that the goggles aren't the only brilliant innovation in the room. There's a double-layer fur parka drying near the door, a snow knife shaped like a giant cheese wedge, boots lined with grass for insulation. Everything in here is a masterclass in function-first design. And then there's the snow itself. Out here, snow isn't just frozen water. It's building material, reflector, insulator. The Inuit used it as walls, mirrors, hunting camo, even for soundproofing. The snow goggles, ironically, helped you see better in a world that was nothing but snow. You squint through the slits, testing them again. They don't blur your vision. They narrow it. They make it easier to focus. You begin to notice details, the texture of the ice outside, the curve of a snowdrift, a subtle shift in the sky that might mean a storm's coming. And you realize vision isn't just about seeing more. Sometimes it's about seeing less, but more clearly. There's even evidence that these goggles weren't just used during daylight hours. In twilight or poor visibility, they still helped block wind and reduce distraction. Think of them like an ancient version of noise-canceling headphones, but for your eyes. A fun side note? The inside of some snow goggles were sometimes rubbed with soot or charcoal. Not just for style points, though let's be honest, it looked cool. The black helped cut additional glare and enhanced contrast. Essentially, they created a smoky lens effect long before lenses were even invented. Your $300 Oakleys are quaking. But here's the kicker. This design, this ancient piece of survival tech, remained virtually unknown to the rest of the world for centuries. European explorers who stumbled upon the Arctic in the 16th and 17th centuries marveled at how the Inuit could see in such blinding light. Many failed to even grasp how the goggles worked. Some thought they were ritual masks. Others took them as signs of primitive superstition. Because, of course, it's easier to dismiss brilliance when it doesn't come with brass fittings or Latin labels. And yet, when these same explorers developed snow blindness themselves, they often ended up borrowing or outright stealing the designs. Funny how emergency changes your tune. You stretch your legs and yawn. The elder smiles, pats the goggles you now wear. It's a quiet reminder that these weren't just objects. They were lessons. Lessons in patience, in precision, in humility before nature. You head back outside, blinking through your new lenses. The world hasn't gotten darker, it's just gotten manageable. The light no longer pierces, it simply shimmers. The wind picks up as you step back out of the igloo, tugging at your parka hood with invisible fingers. Snowflakes swirl in little eddies across the open plain, but you barely notice now. Your eyes are shielded, your steps sure. You've crossed a threshold. The Arctic no longer feels like it's trying to erase you. It's still dangerous, yes, but somehow less hostile. As if you've been given an unofficial passport to survive here. You begin trudging toward the next settlement, just visible on the horizon. An irregular cluster of snow domes and driftwood huts, softly glowing in the low polar sun. The crunch beneath your boots is steady, rhythmic. It lulls you. Inside your head, a thought stirs. What kind of people manage to build lives here? Not just survive, but thrive? The answer unfolds with every step you take. These were master improvisers, engineers of ice, survivalists with a sense of humor, and maybe just a tiny bit stubborn, which in these temperatures is a feature, not a flaw. The ingenuity wasn't limited to goggles. Everything about life in the Arctic was a fine-tuned equation. And while your brain might scream impossible, the Inuit turned 40 below into functional. They used dog sleds to move across vast terrain, ice cellars to store food, and layered clothing that wickeded moisture away instead of trapping it. Historians still argue whether the layered fur parka was inspired by observations of animals or by sheer, uncomfortable experimentation. Either way, it worked. The outer shell, caribou hide with the fur facing out, blocked wind. The inner shell, fur turned inward, kept warmth in. And yes, it made you look like a walking shag carpet, but would you rather be stylish or frostbitten? Even the igloo you just left behind is misunderstood by outsiders. It's not just a snow pile with a door. It's a physics-defying dome, warm enough to sleep in and strong enough to hold your weight if you climbed on top. Snow is a surprisingly good insulator. When compacted, the air trapped between flakes reduces heat loss. Some inner igloos even had different rooms, separated by low snow walls or fur partitions. Open concept, Arctic edition. Of course, this doesn't mean the Inuit life was easy. Not even close. But it was balanced, in harmony with its environment. And nowhere was that harmony more evident than in the smallest details, like the goggles. You pause at the top of a ridge, scanning the icy horizon. The visibility is astonishing. Every crease in the snow, every shadow, sharper now than it would be with the naked eye. You think about what life must have been like for the first person to slip on a pair of these and feel the pain recede. Did they gasp? Laugh? Immediately try to patent it using bark and a friendly raven witness? It makes you wonder how many inventions in human history were born not in triumph but in desperation. A parent shielding their child from the snow's blinding glare. A hunter losing a week of vision after a sunlit trek. A weary elder, tired of squinting, deciding, there must be a better way. And the goggles weren't just about the individual. They had ripple effects. If the hunters could see, they could hunt. If they could hunt, the community ate. If the community ate, they could make it through the month. One small item with enormous consequences. Now imagine trying to explain this to someone in medieval Europe. You show them a carved strip of bone and tell them it helps you see in the sun. They'd probably either crown you a wizard or ask if it repels demons. Possibly both. But that's the irony, isn't it? In a world where progress is often measured by brass telescopes or marble columns, the most quietly revolutionary things often come from the margins. From places so inhospitable, most people never even visit. And yet, that's where brilliance tends to hide. You walk into the next settlement, greeted by a flurry of snow kicked up by a pack of dogs stretching lazily beside a sled. A child peeks out from under a fur hood and then disappears behind a curtain of sealskin. Somewhere nearby, someone's sharpening a harpoon. Someone else is melting snow for water. And in the background, hung neatly by a doorway, are goggles. Dozens of them, different shapes, different materials, each one carefully crafted. They hang not like ornaments but like tools, essential as a knife, as boots, as fire. No pomp, no pretension, just survival. But also legacy. A quirky tidbit? Some snow goggles had not just one but two sets of slits, stacked vertically. Why? No one's quite sure. Maybe they were multi-purpose. Maybe they were backup slits in case snow covered one. Or maybe someone just wanted to be fancy. Historians still argue whether those double-slit goggles were status symbols or just experimental models. Either way, they look cool. Like ancient bifocals with attitude. You lean against a snow wall and take one more long look through your lenses. It's funny. You're wearing one of the oldest forms of eye protection known to humanity, and somehow it still feels futuristic. Sleek, minimalist, pure function, and in a way you're not just seeing through slits of antler or wood. You're seeing through the eyes of every person who came before you, who carved, adjusted, squinted, perfected, who stood here, in this same light, and refused to go blind. The wind shifts again as you walk past the cluster of snow homes, and for a moment, the sun reflects sharply off a nearby ice ridge. Even with your goggles on, you instinctively wince. It's that bright, a shimmering wall of light. You stop and stare, wondering how something so beautiful could be so dangerous. And that's the paradox of the Arctic sun. It looks harmless, even welcoming. But give it a few minutes, and it'll scorch your eyes like a beachside tanning bed with a grudge. The ancient Inuit knew this better than anyone. That's why those narrow slits across your eyes feel less like a convenience now, and more like armor. You pull the goggles up just slightly and look at the snow with unfiltered eyes. Almost immediately, you regret it. It's like staring into a mirror made of knives. You blink rapidly, tearing up, and yank the goggles back down. Instant relief. Vision restored. But what exactly is happening? Why does this bright world, made of soft white powder, feel like it's attacking your eyeballs? Turns out snow blindness isn't just metaphorical. It's a medical condition, photokeratitis if you want the technical name. It's basically a sunburn on your cornea. Not visible on the outside, but trust me, your eyeballs feel the heat. And the damage. After just a few hours in extreme sunlight, especially with UV rays bouncing off fresh snow, you might find yourself completely blind for a day or two. And let's be honest, there are better vacation souvenirs than temporary blindness and searing eye pain. The symptoms can hit suddenly. Itching, tearing, sensitivity to light, headaches. In more severe cases, people have reported disorientation or even hallucinations. One 19th century Arctic explorer wrote about seeing dancing white horses in the snow after going without eye protection for too long. Charming imagery. Until you realize he was lying in a sled, semi-conscious, because his retinas were practically toast. And how did the Inuit treat it? That's the remarkable part. Before pharmaceuticals and optometrists, they had their own methods, cool compresses made from snow, yes, the very thing that caused the problem, herbal poultices, and above all, rest and darkness. Sometimes people were wrapped in blankets and kept inside igloos for days, waiting for the pain to pass. There are even whispered accounts of shamans performing healing chants for snow blindness, though historians still argue whether those were actual treatments or more symbolic comfort rituals. A quirky little fact. Some oral traditions say that looking at certain patterns in the snow too long, especially spirals left by wind, could hypnotize the eye, pulling you into a kind of trance that led to temporary blindness. Sounds mythical, right? But when you've got nothing but endless white around you and light coming at you from all directions, the line between science and story gets very, very blurry. And while the Arctic sun was the worst offender, it wasn't alone. The glare off frozen sea ice, glacial cliffs, and wet snow during melt season could be just as brutal. In some regions, people learned to recognize eye days. Those bright, windless days when it was particularly risky to go out without protection. The seasoned elders would warn you. They'd say things like, "Today, even the shadows are sharp." So it wasn't just about goggles. It was about timing, awareness, community wisdom, and that's something modern life tends to forget. Back then, your vision wasn't yours alone, it was a shared asset. If one hunter lost their sight, the group's survival got harder. So you protected yourself not just for your sake, but for the sake of everyone who relied on your eyes. That shared responsibility gave rise to some pretty clever preventive strategies. Kids were taught early to squint instinctively in the sun. Families made tiny training goggles from bark for toddlers, not toys, not costumes, but practical tools to instill habits young. There's even evidence some groups sang little songs to children while tying their goggles, repeating phrases about seeing strong and facing the white fire. Parenting tip: lullabies and eye safety go surprisingly well together. Historians still debate how widespread snow goggles were across the Arctic. Some regions used them more religiously, while others had less need, thanks to frequent cloud cover or different environmental angles. But one thing's clear: the communities that needed them really needed them, and they made sure everyone knew it. You pause again at the edge of a frozen inlet. A narrow crack cuts through the ice like a black ribbon, and you realize how easy it would be to miss without your goggles. You remember hearing that even modern rescue pilots wear specially tinted lenses when flying over snowfields. Otherwise, they might overlook deep crevasses or obstacles that blend into the white. Isn't that something? A technology born in an igloo is still saving lives from the cockpit of a search and rescue chopper. You kneel down beside the crack, watching the icy water bubble beneath. It's mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, until you remember those spirals and the warnings. You blink and look away. Better not test your luck. As you stand, your reflection catches briefly in a jagged chunk of ice. It's a warped image, face half obscured by fur and those gleaming, narrow ice slits. You look like a time traveler, a living link in a chain that stretches back thousands of years. And for just a moment, it's not the sun you fear. It's forgetting how much we owe to the people who figured this out long before anyone else even thought to try. You run your fingers gently along the smooth, cold surface of the snow goggles you now wear, marveling at the craftsmanship. They're not just survival gear, they're art. Each pair carved meticulously from caribou antler or driftwood, sometimes even walrus ivory, shaped to fit the contours of the face as if tailor-made. The edges are polished so finely they catch the faintest glimmer of light, while the slits are razor-thin, barely wide enough for your eyes to peek through. It's the kind of detail that could only come from generations of painstaking practice. This isn't a hurried DIY project, it's an artisan's work. These goggles are the Rolex watches of the Arctic, combining functionality and style in perfect harmony. And like any luxury brand, there's variation from the austere and minimal to those adorned with delicate carvings and etched patterns. Maybe these decorations told a story, marked status, or simply satisfied the human itch to make survival beautiful. You might find it amusing that such humble items were the ancestors of the sunglasses we slap on to look cool at the beach or block out a hangover's glare. Yet, these bone goggles did more than just shade eyes, they saved lives. The materials themselves say a lot. Caribou antler is lightweight yet incredibly durable, perfect for a harsh climate where every ounce counts. Driftwood was a clever alternative for those without access to bone, and in some areas, even ivory and baleen were used. Each material offered subtle differences in weight, flexibility, and warmth. Historians still argue whether the choice of material affected the effectiveness of the goggles or if it was more about what was locally available. Either way, the ingenuity lies in using what nature provides, proving once again that necessity breeds innovation. You notice the subtle curvature along the sides, designed to wrap slightly around the face to block peripheral glare, a feature that must have come after countless seasons of trial and error. It's like a natural visor, and the more you study it, the more you realize just how thoughtful this design was. A quirky tidbit: some goggles had tiny holes drilled above or below the slits. Were these decorative? Ventilation? Or perhaps to allow slight peripheral vision without compromising glare reduction? The jury's still out. Scholars still debate the purpose, but it's fun to imagine ancient Arctic fashion statements. "Honey, your goggles have extra holes today." You smile at the thought. In terms of function, the slits weren't just narrow to reduce light, but also cleverly positioned to sharpen vision. The pinhole effect created by these slits increases depth of field, letting you see details more clearly. Think of it like squinting on purpose. The narrower the slit, the crisper the image. This was crucial for spotting seals poking through ice holes or tracking distant prey. Meanwhile, the goggles also limited exposure to blowing snow and wind, preventing painful eye dryness. So they were multitaskers, protection from glare, snow, and wind, three major enemies in the Arctic environment. You might laugh, but these ancient goggles even anticipated some modern design principles. For instance, the snug fit around the face reduced fogging, something many of us struggle with today in our fancy ski goggles or cycling glasses. Imagine wearing bulky, foggy goggles while trying to stalk a seal through ice cracks. Not exactly a recipe for success. But the Inuit knew this well. The goggles hugged the face closely without suffocating, balanced perfectly with fur hoods and face masks. Historians still argue whether the ornamental carvings held spiritual significance or were simply decorative. Some theories suggest they represented clan markings or were meant to invoke protection from the spirits. After all, in many indigenous cultures, tools and clothing blur the line between the practical and the sacred. You stare at a pair with subtle wave patterns carved along the edges. They look like frozen ocean currents, a silent homage to the sea that sustains life here. It's humbling to realize that in this vast, stark landscape, people found ways to combine survival, art, and identity in something as seemingly simple as snow goggles. Your fingers trace the carved details one last time before slipping the goggles back on. The familiar narrowing of your vision sharpens again. You feel a little cooler, a little safer. Like you're wearing not just a tool, but a legacy. As you step away from the cold, stark Arctic landscapes in your mind, your thoughts drift southward, far from the frozen tundra into the blazing deserts of ancient Egypt. Here, the sun is a ruthless monarch, commanding respect and fear. And yet, despite the intense glare, the ancient Egyptians developed their own clever ways to shield their eyes, just not quite with carved bone and narrow slits. You picture yourself walking along the Nile's edge, golden sands stretching beyond the palm-lined banks. The air is thick with heat and dust, the sun beating down mercilessly. You see the regal figures of pharaohs and priests, their faces adorned with thick black eye paint extending in elegant wings toward the temples. This is coal, a mix of galena, lead sulfide, and other minerals, applied not just for beauty but for protection. Surprisingly, coal isn't just cosmetic. It's an ancient form of sunscreen and eye protection, designed to reduce the harsh glare and possibly shield against infections. The dark pigment absorbs sunlight, cutting down the amount of reflected light entering the eyes. Some modern studies suggest it might even have antimicrobial properties. Imagine a time before sunglasses when eye health was a life or death matter, especially for those who spent long hours under unrelenting sunlight. The Egyptian solution was elegant in its simplicity. Paint your eyelids dark, like a natural pair of sunglasses. There's no carved antler, but it did the job. Historians still argue whether the eye paint's protective qualities were the primary reason for its use, or if religious symbolism and aesthetics took precedence. Either way, the lines painted around the eyes became iconic, making the cat eye look popular millennia before it hit Hollywood red carpets. Here's a fun side note. Some texts suggest the pigment helped reduce the glare of the desert sands and also repelled flies and other pests that might irritate the eyes. So it was practical and stylish, kind of like wearing sunglasses with bug spray built in. You wander through an ancient market, hearing the chatter of traders bartering for spices and linen. Craftsmen are busy making intricate jewelry, while scribes write on papyrus scrolls, their eyes squinting under the bright sun. Their hands probably carried little carved goggles made of bone, right? Well, actually, no. This technology seems to have stayed mostly northern for centuries, even as Egypt and Mesopotamia flourished under their own suns. Yet, the concept of eye protection through modification was very much alive. Some priests wore special veils or hats designed to shade their eyes during ceremonies, and travelers often draped scarves over their heads, casting shadows across their faces. Imagine explaining Inuit snow goggles to an Egyptian artisan. They might have found the idea intriguing but alien. After all, their sun was dry, the glare coming from sand and water, not ice and snow. Still, this is a reminder that different environments breed different solutions. While the Inuit carved sunglasses from bone, Egyptians painted on their own shade. Both adapted ingeniously to the challenges their worlds posed. And so, your journey extends beyond the Arctic. It stretches across deserts and glaciers, linking human ingenuity through climate and culture. Wherever the sun threatened your vision, people found a way to fight back, sometimes with carved bone, sometimes with mineral paint. It's a fascinating dance of survival and creativity, reminding you that our ancestors were always looking for ways to see better and live longer. And that some solutions, no matter how far-flung or quirky, end up converging on the same goal: protecting the fragile window to our souls, our eyes. You step back into the snow, but this time your journey follows the whispers of trade routes and migration paths, traveling beyond the Inuit homeland. The snow goggles, those clever slits of bone and wood, didn't remain confined to the Arctic. Their influence crept farther than you might expect, carried by wandering peoples, trade, and sometimes sheer necessity. You imagine the routes stretching across frozen Siberian landscapes, winding through mountain passes and endless forests. Small nomadic groups passed ideas along like precious cargo, snow goggles among them. In these harsh environments, the need to protect one's vision was universal. Historians still argue whether these designs reached Siberia independently or if they were directly inspired by Inuit craftsmanship. Some archaeological finds suggest that similar goggles, made from bone or wood with narrow slits, appeared in Siberian cultures around the same time. The similarities are striking, but the question remains: was this convergent evolution or cultural diffusion? You stand on the edge of a frozen river in your mind, picturing hunters squinting through slits, scanning the white horizon for prey. The goggles didn't just block the sun. They were a survival language, spoken silently across generations and geography. It's surprising how these humble artifacts connect disparate cultures. In some Siberian groups, goggles were even fashioned with attached fur linings to keep snow and cold out. The idea of layering, combining materials for function, feels like an Arctic design principle. Meanwhile, back west, some early European explorers in the 16th and 17th centuries encountered Arctic natives, wearing snow goggles, and documented them with awe and confusion. For a long time, the wider world considered the goggles exotic oddities rather than practical inventions. And yet, the essence of the design, narrow eye slits to block glare, eventually permeated into other traditions. Though snow goggles never became mainstream outside polar regions, their principle inspired various forms of protective eyewear. A quirky tidbit here: there's a fascinating but little-known case of goggles with vertical slits being found in some Siberian burials. The purpose of those vertical slits remains a mystery, and historians still argue whether they were meant for specialized vision, spiritual reasons, or even a unique kind of protection. These variations remind you that even the best inventions morph as they travel, shaped by local needs and beliefs. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but a conversation across cultures. As you picture the frozen trade routes, you realize these goggles symbolize more than eye protection. They are tokens of human ingenuity, adaptation, and connection across seemingly isolated worlds. It's a reminder that even in the coldest, most remote places, ideas travel faster than you might think, carried on the breath of traders, hunters, and dreamers. You tuck that thought away and prepare for your next step in this story: a glance towards sunnier, dustier places where different solutions to eye protection were taking shape. You find yourself transported to the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean, where history's great empires rose and fell beneath a dazzling sky. Here, squinting wasn't just a reflex, it was a way of life. Gladiators, senators, and emperors alike sought ways to shield their eyes from the relentless glare. You picture a Roman gladiator stepping into the arena, visorless and barefaced, squinting fiercely against the midday sun. There were no bone goggles or slits carved from antler here. Instead, the Romans improvised, relying on smoky quartz and tinted glass, though rudimentary by today's standards. Historians still argue exactly how prevalent these early forms of protective eyewear were. Some say they were luxuries reserved for the elite, while others believe they were practical tools used by soldiers and charioteers to improve vision and reduce glare during battle. There's an intriguing legend that Emperor Nero wore polished emeralds to watch gladiatorial contests, though historians debate whether this was for spectacle, vision correction, or to protect his eyes from the sun's glare. The idea of a green-tinted lens is surprisingly modern, like the ancestor of today's polarized glasses. On the fringes of the empire, common folk improvised with smoky quartz crystals. These naturally dark stones could be shaped and worn as primitive sunglasses, reducing the sun's harshness. They weren't perfect, but in a world without sunglasses, even a little shade was a blessing. Interestingly, the Romans also used eye cosmetics much like the Egyptians, though more for fashion and ritual than sun protection. Coal and similar substances made appearances, especially among women. You imagine the scene. A gladiator wiping sweat from his brow, squinting under the brutal sun, trying to spot an opponent's opening. Maybe he wished for Inuit-style goggles, narrow and practical, rather than risking sun blindness in the arena. A quirky tidbit? The Roman poet Juvenal once joked about men who squinted, as if hiding secrets behind their eyes. While that was probably metaphorical, it's a reminder that squinting had social meanings too, not just practical ones. As you wander through Roman marketplaces and colonnades, you notice the beginning of a cultural shift. Eye protection was moving from pure survival to a blend of status, style, and practicality. This trend would only grow in the centuries to come. You realize that while the Mediterranean never embraced the carved snow goggles, the core idea of shielding the eyes endured. The quest to conquer light, glare, and glare-induced blindness was universal, even if the methods varied wildly. You blink into the bright sunshine once more, feeling a deep appreciation for the variety of human ingenuity. Whether carved from antler or fashioned from glass, every solution tells a story of struggle, adaptation, and style. Now, you glide across centuries and lands, arriving in the shimmering canals of 18th-century Venice. A city floating on water, bathed in light and buzzing with fashion, intrigue, and invention. Here, sunglasses begin their slow transformation from pure practicality to fashion statement, worn by aristocrats who delight in their mystique and mysticism. Imagine walking down the narrow, bustling streets, your footsteps muffled by gondolas gliding under stone bridges. Venetian nobles stroll by, faces framed by elaborate lace and powdered wigs, their eyes hidden behind tinted glass lenses held in delicate frames. The lenses are often colored emerald green, smoky brown, even blue, not just for sun protection but for style and sometimes secrecy. These early sunglasses, though crude compared to today's standards, serve dual purposes. They shield from the glare bouncing off the water and marble buildings, and they signal status. Wearing tinted glasses becomes a subtle way of hiding your gaze, whether from curious onlookers or secret lovers. Historians still argue about the exact origins of the Venetian tinted glass tradition. Some claim glassmakers in Murano developed colored lenses as a byproduct of their glass artistry, while others suggest they adapted imported technologies from the East. The quirky truth is that these sunglasses also offered a hint of mystery. To hide one's eyes was to wield power. Venetian courtesans reportedly used sunglasses to flirt without giving away too much. Masks and glasses together created layers of secrecy and allure, blending function with fashion. You picture an 18th-century Venetian ball, with couples swirling beneath chandeliers. A noblewoman raises her glass, her eyes behind dark lenses sparkling with intrigue. Sunglasses are not just protection here. They are a weapon of social dance. In this era, the concept of eyewear begins to shift. It's no longer solely about survival or basic utility, but enters the realm of identity and personal expression. The spectacle, pun intended, becomes part of the game. And yet, for all their glamour, these Venetian glasses still echo their Arctic ancestors in one key way. They're about controlling how much light and information reaches your eyes. They give you power over your vision and over what you reveal to others. It's a delicate balance of exposure and concealment that would carry forward into the modern world. You step onto a gondola for a moment, feeling the gentle sway of water beneath you, and marvel at how something as simple as tinted glass has traveled from icy survival gear to high society's must-have accessory. The journey of sunglasses is far from over. The gondola glides silently away, and your mind drifts to the American Wild West. Vast deserts, sun-bleached plains, and endless skies. Here, sunglasses take on a rugged new identity, worn by cowboys, prospectors, and frontier settlers who stare down blazing suns and swirling dust storms. You picture a weather-beaten cowboy squinting into the horizon, the sun merciless and unforgiving. His options are limited, but necessity pushes innovation. Early versions of sunglasses in this era often involved darkened glass or smoked lenses, sometimes cobbled together from whatever materials were at hand. The iconic aviator style hasn't yet appeared, but rudimentary sunshades are gaining popularity among those who spend long days outside. These are not just fashion statements but critical gear for survival in harsh climates. Historians still argue when exactly sunglasses became common in the American West, but diaries and photographs suggest that by the late 19th century, tinted spectacles were increasingly used to combat glare, dust, and debris. A quirky tidbit: some prospectors in the Gold Rush era reportedly crafted makeshift goggles from discarded glass bottles, ground down to fit in frames or even wrapped in leather. They weren't pretty, but they worked. The dusty trails and rugged landscapes called for practicality. Sunglasses needed to stay put during rough rides and offer protection against not just sunlight but flying grit kicked up by horses and wagons. You imagine a stagecoach barreling through a dusty canyon, the driver's eyes shielded by dark lenses, face grim with concentration. These sunglasses were a frontier tool like hats, boots, and guns. Yet, even here, sunglasses were more than utility. They signaled a certain persona: the stoic, unflinching individual who could stare down the elements and keep going. They were part of the mythos of the West. From the Arctic to Venice to the American frontier, sunglasses have evolved and adapted, reflecting the environments and cultures that shaped them. You wipe a bit of dust from your goggles and smile at the realization: sunglasses aren't just a modern convenience. They're a storybook of human resilience, innovation, and style, written in bone, glass, and leather. The gondola glides silently away, and your mind drifts to the American Wild West. Vast deserts, sun-bleached plains, and endless skies. Here, sunglasses take on a rugged new identity, worn by cowboys, prospectors, and frontier settlers who stare down blazing suns and swirling dust storms. You picture a weather-beaten cowboy squinting into the horizon, the sun merciless and unforgiving. His options are limited, but necessity pushes innovation. Early versions of sunglasses in this era often involved darkened glass or smoked lenses, sometimes cobbled together from whatever materials were at hand. The iconic aviator style hasn't yet appeared, but rudimentary sunshades are gaining popularity among those who spend long days outside. These are not just fashion statements but critical gear for survival in harsh climates. Historians still argue when exactly sunglasses became common in the American West, but diaries and photographs suggest that by the late 19th century, tinted spectacles were increasingly used to combat glare, dust, and debris. A quirky tidbit: some prospectors in the Gold Rush era reportedly crafted makeshift goggles from discarded glass bottles, ground down to fit in frames or even wrapped in leather. They weren't pretty, but they worked. The dusty trails and rugged landscapes called for practicality. Sunglasses needed to stay put during rough rides and offer protection against not just sunlight but flying grit kicked up by horses and wagons. You imagine a stagecoach barreling through a dusty canyon, the driver's eyes shielded by dark lenses, face grim with concentration. These sunglasses were a frontier tool like hats, boots, and guns. Yet, even here, sunglasses were more than utility. They signaled a certain persona: the stoic, unflinching individual who could stare down the elements and keep going. They were part of the mythos of the West. From the Arctic to Venice to the American frontier, sunglasses have evolved and adapted, reflecting the environments and cultures that shaped them. You wipe a bit of dust from your goggles and smile at the realization: sunglasses aren't just a modern convenience. They're a storybook of human resilience, innovation, and style, written in bone, glass, and leather. You pause for a moment and imagine the invention of the modern sunglass lens. It wasn't a singular moment but rather a gradual evolution influenced by science, fashion, and practicality. Enter the 20th century, where technology and mass production would transform sunglasses from niche survival gear into ubiquitous accessories. It's the era of innovation. Optical glass improved, allowing lenses to be ground with precision. Tinted lenses were no longer just dark or smoky but came in a spectrum of colors designed to enhance contrast or reduce glare. Polarized lenses, which dramatically cut down reflected light, began to appear mid-century, revolutionizing outdoor eyewear. You think about how aviators came into the picture during World War II. Designed for pilots who had to stare into the bright sky for hours, these sunglasses featured large lenses that covered much of the eye area, providing comprehensive protection. The aviator style quickly jumped from airfields to city streets, becoming a fashion icon. Historians still argue how much military needs drove sunglass innovation versus civilian fashion trends. Some believe soldiers' demand for better eye protection accelerated research, while others argue that public appetite for style was the real catalyst. A quirky tidbit: Ray-Ban, the brand synonymous with aviators, initially called their model anti-glare sunglasses when launched in 1937. The term Ray-Ban itself wasn't coined until later. Imagine telling someone in the Arctic that one day these small slits in goggles would inspire a global brand known worldwide. You consider how sunglasses also became symbols of rebellion and coolness. Think Hollywood stars of the 50s and 60s like James Dean and Audrey Hepburn, who popularized sunglasses as fashion statements as much as protection. The lens technology also diversified: photochromic lenses that darken in sunlight, mirrored coatings, and frames made from new lightweight plastics. Sunglasses were now a blend of science and art, comfort and personality. But underneath it all, the primal need remains the same: to guard our eyes from harsh light, dust, and injury. That instinct to shield your vision stretches back to the Inuit carving slits in bone to stare down a blizzard. You realize sunglasses are not just about what's in front of your eyes, but about what you choose to see, and how clearly. Your mind drifts to the cultural symbolism sunglasses have accumulated over time. No longer merely tools for survival or fashion, sunglasses became icons of mystery, power, and persona. Think of the classic noir detective: dark lenses hiding secrets and intentions. Sunglasses shield emotions, create distance, and provide a barrier. They transform the wearer. Behind those dark lenses, you could be anyone. The ambiguity grants anonymity, a superpower in social interaction. In some societies, sunglasses even became tools of social control or political power. Dictators and celebrities alike don them to shield their gaze from the public, to avoid revealing too much, or to project an aura of untouchable coolness. Historians still argue whether sunglasses in politics first appeared as practical tools or calculated symbols. Was it a case of convenience or image crafting? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. A quirky tidbit: in some cultures, wearing sunglasses indoors is considered rude, while in others, it's seen as a sign of status and style. The social rules around sunglasses are surprisingly complex and varied. You ponder the psychology behind sunglasses. Studies show people perceive those wearing sunglasses as more attractive, confident, and mysterious. That psychological power adds another layer to these ancient tools. Yet, this modern symbolic use contrasts sharply with the raw, urgent needs that birthed snow goggles thousands of years ago. It's a journey from life-saving necessity to fashion and cultural statement. But at the heart of it all, the instinct remains: to control how much light and information your eyes receive, and what you reveal to the world. Your fingers brush your own lenses and you smile softly, appreciating the long, winding journey that brought this simple accessory from icy Arctic tunnels to neon-lit city streets. The history of sunglasses wouldn't be complete without considering the environmental impacts of our modern obsession with eyewear. With millions of pairs produced annually, sunglasses have become a major industry, and, like many industries, one that wrestles with sustainability challenges. You think about the materials used: plastics derived from petroleum, metal frames requiring mining, and lenses coated with chemicals for polarization and tinting. While innovations have led to biodegradable frames and recycled materials, the vast majority of sunglasses still contribute to environmental waste. It's a sobering contrast to the Inuit snow goggles, made entirely from natural, locally sourced materials, designed to last and be reused for generations. Those ancient goggles embodied sustainability, crafted to serve a critical function in harmony with the environment. Historians still argue whether the modern push for sustainable eyewear can genuinely replace mass-produced, disposable sunglasses. The industry's answer is evolving, but consumer habits also play a role. A quirky tidbit: some companies have started offering sunglasses made from recycled fishing nets or bamboo, combining eco-consciousness with style. There are even artists who create one-of-a-kind goggles and glasses from reclaimed materials, turning sustainability into wearable art. You reflect on how this shift back toward environmentally friendly materials is almost a full circle, a nod to ancient practices where nothing was wasted and every part of an animal or plant had a purpose. This thoughtful craftsmanship carries a quiet wisdom, reminding you that innovation isn't always about new technology. Sometimes, it's about rediscovering and respecting what our ancestors already knew. With that, you adjust your goggles and step forward, carrying both history and hope in your vision. As twilight descends over your mental landscape, you contemplate the future of sunglasses and eye protection in a rapidly changing world. Technology is moving fast, and what was once carved from bone or crafted from simple glass is now intertwined with cutting-edge materials and smart capabilities. You imagine sunglasses embedded with augmented reality displays, projecting information directly onto your retina. The days of squinting into the sun might soon be replaced by digital shields that adjust tint in real time, monitor UV exposure, and even offer night vision or thermal imaging. Historians still argue how quickly these advancements will become commonplace and accessible. Will high-tech eyewear be a luxury for the few or a necessity for all? And how will this shift reshape our relationship with light and vision? A quirky tidbit: prototypes of smart glasses already exist that can translate languages instantly, record video, or adjust lenses automatically based on lighting. It's like stepping into science fiction, yet rooted in humanity's age-old need to see clearly and comfortably. Despite these futuristic leaps, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged: protecting the eyes while allowing you to engage with the world. You feel a profound connection to those ancient artisans who first carved their snow goggles, understanding that no matter the era, the quest to master light and vision is a constant human story. As you pull your modern sunglasses low and gaze toward the horizon, you realize that this journey is not just about history. It's about the evolving human experience itself. As night deepens and the world quiets, you reflect on the remarkable journey sunglasses have taken. From the first Inuit snow goggles, carved with care to battle blinding snow glare, to the sleek, high-tech eyewear of today. Each pair tells a story of human resilience, adaptation, and creativity. They are more than just tools. They are artifacts of culture, symbols of identity, and companions in adventure. You remember the narrow slits cutting through bone, the shimmering painted eyes of Egyptian priests, the smoky lenses of Venetian nobles, and the rugged glass of frontier cowboys, all linked by a shared human need to see the world clearly, to protect the delicate windows of our souls. Historians still argue over the finer details of this story, but one truth shines bright: our ancestors' innovations, born of necessity and environment, continue to shape how we engage with light and vision. You smile softly as the final images fade, the warmth of your own room replacing the cold Arctic wind and the blazing desert sun. The goggles rest lightly on your nose, a timeless bridge across millennia. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may your eyes always be protected.